Have you ever stood amidst ancient ruins and felt a shiver of mystery run down your spine? What stories do these silent stones hold? What happened to the people who built them? Throughout human history, entire civilizations have risen to astonishing heights of power, culture, and innovation only to vanish completely, leaving behind little more than crumbling monuments and unanswered questions. It's a haunting thought that somewhere, right now, the remnants of a lost city might lie undiscovered beneath our feet, holding secrets we can only begin to imagine. These aren't just forgotten towns or abandoned outposts. We're talking about vast societies, complex cultures, and thousands of lives that seemingly evaporated into thin air. Think about it for a moment. How does an entire civilization simply disappear? Not just a village, not just a tribe, but sprawling empires with intricate governments, advanced technologies, and rich artistic traditions gone. No records, no clear descendants, no definitive explanation. It's one of history's most compelling and eerie puzzles. We're drawn to these mysteries not just out of curiosity, but because they remind us of our own fragility. They challenge our belief in permanence. They make us wonder, if societies so powerful and sophisticated could vanish without a trace, what does that say about our own future? That's exactly what we're diving into today. In this video, we'll explore 30 of the most fascinating lost civilizations that disappeared without leaving a clear roadmap of their fate. From sunken cities swallowed by the sea to desert capitals abandoned overnight, each story is a window into humanity's unshakable drive to create, evolve, and sometimes vanish. So settle in, open your mind to the possibilities, and join me on a journey through time, a journey into the shadows of history, where the echoes of the past are waiting to be heard once more. And we begin our journey with one of the most astonishing and puzzling disappearances in human history, the Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan culture. At its peak around 2500 BC, this was a true Bronze Age titan, a contemporary of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, but one that stretched over a vast area of what is now Pakistan and northwest India. Its sheer scale is almost incomprehensible. This was a society that supported a population of over 5 million people, a number that wouldn't be seen again in the region for thousands of years. They weren't just numerous, they were incredibly advanced, building some of the world's first meticulously planned cities. The great metropolises of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa are the crown jewels of this lost world. Walking through their ruins, you wouldn't get the sense of a haphazard, organically grown settlement. Instead, you'd find a grid of wide, straight streets cutting perfect right angles, dividing the city into neat city blocks. This wasn't just for looks, it was a masterpiece of urban planning. The houses, built from standardized, kiln-fired bricks of remarkably consistent size, were surprisingly sophisticated, many featuring indoor wells and dedicated bathing areas. But perhaps most impressively, they boasted the world's first known urban sanitation systems. A complex network of covered drains ran beneath the streets, carrying waste away from homes and out of the city, a public health innovation that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 3 millennia. This points to a highly organized, centralized authority, one capable of orchestrating such a massive public works project for the common good. Yet, for all their tangible achievements, the people of the Indus Valley remain silent and enigmatic. They left behind over 4,000 artifacts inscribed with a unique, beautifully crafted script, but despite decades of effort by the world's top linguists and cryptographers, it has never been deciphered. We can see their symbols, fish, birds, intricate geometric patterns, but we cannot hear their words. Their language, their literature, their names, their laws, their thoughts, all of it is locked away, making it incredibly difficult to understand their social structure or their belief system. We have no grand palaces stuffed with treasure, no colossal statues of warrior kings, no records of epic battles. This conspicuous absence of obvious central rulers or temples suggests a society that might have been more focused on commerce and community than conquest and glorification of a single leader. So what happened to this stable, prosperous, and seemingly peaceful civilization? Around 1900 BC, the lights began to go out. The story isn't one of a single catastrophic event, but a slow, agonizing fade to black. The archaeological record shows a gradual decline. The meticulously laid streets began to be encroached upon by shoddier buildings. The high standards of craftsmanship and sanitation started to slip. The long-distance trade networks that had brought lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and carnelian from Gujarat slowly withered. The once bustling cities grew quieter, and then, eventually, they were empty. Theories for their downfall are as varied as they are compelling. Some experts point to climate change, suggesting that the monsoons that fed the Indus River and its tributaries began to shift, leading to prolonged and devastating droughts that crippled their agricultural base. Others point to geological evidence of massive floods that could have repeatedly inundated their farmlands and cities, slowly breaking their spirit and their economy. Another theory suggests the sacred Gagga-Hakra River, thought to be the lifeblood of the civilization, simply dried up, forcing a massive, slow migration eastward. There's even the possibility of invasions or conflicts with incoming groups, though the lack of widespread evidence of violent destruction makes this less likely. The truth is, it was probably a tragic combination of these factors, a perfect storm of environmental and social crises that ultimately caused this great, ordered society to simply unravel, its people dispersing and assimilating into new cultures, leaving their magnificent, silent cities to the dust. From the ordered streets of the Indus Valley, we travel west across continents and seas to a civilization defined not by rigid grids, but by breathtaking artistry and a deep connection to the ocean, the magnificent Minoans of Crete. Flourishing from roughly 3000 to 1450 BC, they were the first advanced society in Europe, a vibrant and seemingly peaceful culture whose influence reached across the entire Mediterranean. Their heart was the incredible palace complex of Knossos, a structure so vast and complex with its multi-storied buildings, intricate corridors, and hundreds of interconnecting rooms that it later inspired the Greek myth of the Minotaur's labyrinth. Walking through its reconstructed remains today, you are immediately struck by the sheer joy of life reflected in its art. The walls are adorned with vibrant frescoes depicting lithe athletes leaping over charging bulls, elegant ladies with elaborate hairstyles, and schools of dolphins dancing through azure waves. There are no grand scenes of conquest or subjugation here, only a celebration of nature, ritual, and human grace. This was the center of a formidable maritime empire. The Minoans were the undisputed masters of the sea, their sturdy ships creating a vast trade network that stretched from the coasts of Anatolia and Egypt to the islands of the Aegean and beyond. They traded exquisite pottery, prized saffron, and finely crafted metalwork, bringing back raw materials and ideas that further enriched their culture. Their society appears to have been remarkably progressive, with women playing prominent roles in religious ceremonies and public life, as shown in the famous fresco of the snake goddess. Their administrative system used a script we call Linear A, found inscribed on clay tablets that likely recorded inventories of goods, trade deals, and economic data. Like the Indus Valley script, Linear A has stubbornly resisted all attempts at decipherment, keeping the Minoans' own voices just out of our reach. Then, around the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, this brilliant civilization was extinguished. The leading theory for their downfall points to one of the most violent volcanic cataclysms in human history, the eruption of Thera, the modern island of Santorini, located just 70 miles north of Crete. This was not a simple blast, it was a volcanic event orders of magnitude greater than Krakatoa. The eruption would have been utterly apocalyptic for the Minoans. First, a massive earthquake would have rattled Crete, damaging their palaces and ports. Then, a towering plume of ash would have darkened the sky for weeks, choking the island and burying its fertile farmlands, leading to catastrophic famine. This would have been followed by a colossal tsunami, a wall of water hundreds of feet high roaring across the sea to smash into the northern coast of Crete, utterly devastating their mighty fleet, the very source of their wealth and power, and inundating their coastal settlements. This natural disaster would have left the Minoan civilization mortally wounded, its infrastructure shattered, its population starving, and its navy destroyed. In this critically weakened state, they became easy prey. Within a century, the great palace at Knossos shows clear signs of a takeover. The architecture changes and a new script, Linear B, appears on tablets. We can read Linear B and it reveals something crucial. It was used to write an early form of Greek. The evidence strongly suggests that the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, perhaps once trading partners or rivals, moved in to fill the power vacuum. They seized control of Knossos, and over time the distinct Minoan culture was absorbed and assimilated, its flame snuffed out by a 1-2 punch of geological fury and foreign invasion. The labyrinth stood, but the vibrant, bull-leaping people who built it were gone, leaving behind only their beautiful, silent art and the haunting mystery of their final days. But our journey into the vanished continues, and it leads us next from the Mediterranean sun to the dense, humid jungles of Mesoamerica, home to one of history's most intellectually brilliant and mysteriously fallen societies, the Maya. Unlike the relatively centralized empires we've discussed, the Maya world was a vast collection of powerful, independent city-states, each with its own revered dynasty of kings, all sharing a deeply sophisticated culture. Their civilization wasn't just advanced, it was a true intellectual powerhouse, achieving staggering heights in mathematics, astronomy, and writing while Europe was languishing in its dark ages. They grasped the concept of 0 centuries before it appeared elsewhere, and their astronomical calculations were so precise they could predict planetary movements and solar eclipses with an accuracy that would not be matched for over 1,000 years. This profound understanding of the cosmos was woven into the very fabric of their existence, most famously expressed through their elaborate and interconnected calendar systems. They didn't just track time, they orchestrated their lives by it, from the planting of crops to the timing of sacred wars, all guided by a complex wheel of calendars that measured everything from a 260-day sacred cycle to a mammoth long-count calendar stretching across millennia. Their cities were physical manifestations of this cosmic order. In places like Tikal, immense limestone pyramid temples, shrouded in jungle canopy, pierced the sky, designed to bring priests and rulers closer to the heavens. At Palenque, intricately crafted palaces and tombs featured elaborate carvings that recorded the divine bloodlines of their kings, who communicated with ancestors and gods through violent, ritualistic bloodletting ceremonies. For centuries, these city-states thrived, their populations growing, their art flourishing, and their power seemingly unshakable. Then, in what stands as one of archaeology's greatest puzzles, the heart of this civilization simply stopped beating. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, during what is known as the Classic Maya collapse, the great lowland cities of the southern Yucatan Peninsula were systematically abandoned. It wasn't a single event, but a rolling catastrophe. One by one, the stelae, the carved stone monuments that recorded the deeds and the precise dates of kings, ceased to be erected. The grand architectural projects halted mid-construction. The palaces and plazas, once teeming with life, fell silent and were slowly, deliberately consumed by the relentless jungle. So what could possibly cause such a widespread and precipitous fall? The evidence points not to a single villain, but to a devastating cascade of failures. One prevailing theory centers on a catastrophic, prolonged drought. Analysis of lake sediment and stalagmites reveals that the region suffered a series of intense dry periods that would have crippled maize agriculture, the foundation of the Maya diet and economy. This environmental pressure would have ignited a vicious cycle of famine and desperation. As resources dwindled, the long-standing rivalry between city-states likely erupted into total warfare. The archaeological record shows a marked increase in fortifications, mass graves, and grisly evidence of violence in the terminal Classic period. This wasn't the ritualized, captive-taking warfare of their golden age. This was total war for survival, shattering the political order. The kings, who derived their power from a claimed ability to intercede with the gods for rain and prosperity, would have found their authority utterly shattered as the rains failed and their people starved. The social contract broke down. The elaborate religious and political system that demanded tribute to support the elite class became an unsustainable burden. It's believed that the populace, disillusioned and starving, simply walked away from the great ceremonial centers, retreating into the countryside or migrating to more resilient areas in the north. The collapse wasn't the end of the Maya people. Their descendants are still there today, but it was the absolute and utter end of their grand political and cultural system. The jungle didn't conquer the cities, it merely moved in to reclaim a space that had already been emptied by a perfect storm of environmental disaster, political failure, and social unraveling. Leaving the overgrown pyramids of the Maya behind, we now journey to the steamy jungles of Southeast Asia, where another civilization achieved staggering architectural glory, only to have its heart slowly cease beating. This is the story of the Khmer Empire and its magnificent capital, Angkor. At its zenith between the 9th and 15th centuries, this was the most extensive urban complex in the pre-industrial world, a sprawling metropolis that would have dwarfed any contemporary European city. Its crown jewel, the Temple of Angkor Wat, remains the largest religious monument ever constructed, a breathtaking representation of the Hindu cosmos carved in stone. But to focus solely on the temples is to miss the empire's true genius. The Khmer were not just master architects, they were hydrological engineers without equal. Their entire civilization was built upon a mind-bogglingly complex and vast water management system. The flat terrain around Angkor was transformed into a meticulously engineered landscape of canals, massive reservoirs called barrays, and intricate moats. This network did far more than just look impressive. It was the lifeblood of the empire, a sophisticated machine designed to solve a critical problem, the region's extreme seasonal volatility. It allowed them to store immense quantities of water during the intense monsoon rains, which they could then methodically release throughout the punishingly long dry season. This meant they could support a huge population. Recent estimates suggest up to 750,000 people lived in the greater Angkor area, and achieve rice surpluses that were the foundation of their wealth and power. They could grow not 1 but 2 or even 3 crops of rice per year, an agricultural miracle for the time that fueled their expansion and funded their colossal building projects. For centuries, this system created a stable, prosperous, and resilient society, but its sheer complexity also contained the seeds of its vulnerability. This delicate balance depended on a predictable pattern of rainfall. Recent breakthroughs in climate science using core samples from nearby tree rings have revealed a terrifying truth. The 14th century brought a period of dramatic climate instability to the region. It began with a series of severe, prolonged droughts that would have drastically lowered the water levels in those critical reservoirs, threatening the food supply for the massive urban population. This was followed by an opposite and perhaps even more devastating extreme, a period of intensely powerful monsoon seasons and catastrophic flooding. You can imagine the strain this would place on the system. The carefully calibrated canals and dikes designed for a different climatic era were suddenly overwhelmed. There is archaeological evidence that during this time of crisis, workers were desperately trying to repair and modify the water network, but they were fighting a losing battle. A major flood would have sent torrents of water and silt pouring through the canals, clogging them and destroying the precise gradients that were essential for their operation. The very system designed to control water was in the end defeated by it. This hydrological collapse would have had a domino effect. Failed harvests would have led to widespread famine and social unrest. The king's divine authority, intrinsically linked to his ability to control the waters and ensure prosperity, would have been irreparably damaged. In this weakened state, the empire became susceptible to external pressures. Neighboring powers like the rising Ayutthaya kingdom to the west began to encroach on Khmer territory. The capital was sacked several times in the 15th century, and the economic and spiritual focus of the kingdom gradually shifted southward, closer to the maritime trade routes of the Mekong Delta. The elite, the artisans, and the skilled engineers likely followed the seat of power. Angkor wasn't abandoned overnight in a single cataclysm. It was a gradual but inexorable emptying out. The magnificent stone temples remained, but the sophisticated hydraulic heart that had sustained the metropolis fell silent. The jungle crept in, slowly swallowing the vast urban sprawl, and the greatest city on earth faded into legend, its grandeur hidden until modern explorers once again uncovered the scale of its achievement and the profound lesson of its fall. Now we cross from the jungles of Cambodia to the steamy lowlands of the Gulf Coast, where the very first chapter of complex civilization in the Americas was written by a people whose name we don't even know. We call them the Olmec, a name taken much later from the Aztec language meaning rubber people, for the latex trees that flourished in their homeland. Emerging around 1600 BC, they were the true pioneers, the foundational culture from which nearly all subsequent Mesoamerican societies, the Maya, the Zapotec, even the Aztec, would draw their core identity. This was the mother culture of the Americas. Their most iconic and enduring legacy is also their most baffling, the colossal stone heads. 17 of these monumental sculptures have been discovered, each one a unique, brooding portrait carved from a single gigantic block of basalt. The sheer scale of this undertaking is almost beyond belief. These heads stand up to 11 feet tall and weigh as much as 50 tons, the equivalent of a full-sized school bus made of solid stone. The material itself is part of the mystery. The basalt did not come from the soft, swampy Olmec heartland. It was quarried from the Tuxtla Mountains miles away. We are left to wonder how a society without the wheel, without draft animals, without metal tools, transported these monstrous weights through treacherous jungle and across rivers. The prevailing theory suggests they used a combination of immense log rollers and rafts, a mammoth undertaking that would have required the coordinated labor of hundreds, if not thousands, of people, pointing to a highly organized and stratified society with a powerful ruling class capable of commanding such effort. But to define the Olmec solely by their giant heads is to overlook their profound intellectual achievements. They were master innovators. They developed a sophisticated calendar system and a distinctive form of writing, with a cascadal block bearing what many believe to be the earliest example of writing in the Americas. They played the Mesoamerican ball game, a ritual sport with deep religious significance, in purpose-built stone courts. They carved exquisite celts and figurines from jade, a material they revered, and they likely established the concept of the ceremonial center, a city built around a central plaza with aligned mounds and platforms, a template that would be followed for centuries. For hundreds of years, their great centers of San Lorenzo and later La Venta thrived as bustling hubs of power, religion, and innovation. Then, around 400 BC, something went terribly wrong. Both cities show clear signs of a violent and deliberate end. At San Lorenzo, the archaeological record is chilling. The colossal heads, the pride of the city, were systematically mutilated and defaced. They were not simply toppled over, Their features were carefully gouged out and scarred before being dragged to the edges of the site and buried in long, neat lines. This was not the act of random invaders. It suggests a deeply symbolic, ritualistic destruction, an intentional desecration of the very symbols of royal authority. The city's sacred monuments were similarly attacked and its elaborate drainage system wrecked. Theories for this internal collapse point towards significant environmental change. The region is geologically active, and some evidence suggests shifts in the courses of important rivers that would have crippled trade and agriculture. This could have led to intense civil strife, a popular uprising against a ruling elite who were increasingly seen as having lost the favor of the gods. The people may have turned on their leaders, ritually destroying their monuments to break their power before abandoning the city for good. La Venta met a similar fate a century or two later, also falling into decline and being consumed by the jungle. Unlike later civilizations, the Olmec left behind no vast written records to tell their story. Their disappearance was so complete that their very existence was forgotten for over 2 millennia, their monumental heads staring silently up from the earth as the only testament to the first great civilization of the Americas, a civilization that built an empire of ideas before seemingly turning on itself and vanishing back into the swamp from which it came. From the tropical lowlands of Mesoamerica, we now travel north into the heart of Ice Age North America to meet a people defined by a single, brilliant invention, a people known as the Clovis. This was not a civilization of cities or kings, but one of supremely adaptable hunters who, for a few brief centuries, were the undisputed masters of a continent. Their calling card, found from coast to coast, is one of the most elegant and deadly weapons ever devised, the Clovis point. These are not simple, sharpened rocks. They are works of Stone Age engineering, characterized by a unique flute, a long, shallow channel carefully struck from the base of the point up towards its tip. This fluting was a stroke of genius. It allowed the point to be securely hafted onto a spear shaft, creating a weapon that was both robust and aerodynamically balanced, capable of being thrown with immense force and accuracy. The rapid spread of these distinctive points is a story of incredible human expansion. Around 13,000 years ago, as the massive ice sheets that covered much of North America began their final retreat, these people exploded across the landscape. From the forests of the east to the deserts of the southwest, their artifacts appear with a startling uniformity. This suggests a highly successful culture, a way of life so effective that it was adopted far and wide with incredible speed. Their primary prey were the magnificent and now entirely extinct megafauna of the Pleistocene, towering mammoths, immense mastodons, giant ground sloths, and camels. A successful hunt on a single mammoth could feed a band for weeks, providing not only meat but also bones for tools and hides for shelter. For a time, the Clovis people thrived in this hunter's paradise. Then, in a geological heartbeat, it all fell apart. Around 12,800 years ago, the world turned suddenly and violently cold again. This period, known as the Younger Dryas, was a dramatic reversal of the warming trend, a 1,000-year-long deep freeze that plunged the northern hemisphere back into glacial conditions. The evidence on the ground is stark and sudden. The beautiful, fluted Clovis points vanish from the archaeological record. The fossil record tells an even more chilling tale. This is the precise moment when North America's megafauna, over 75 species of large mammals, including the mammoths, mastodons, and saber-toothed cats that were the Clovis's livelihood, disappear forever. This synchronicity of events has led to one of the most controversial and captivating theories in modern archaeology, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The proposal is as dramatic as it sounds. A group of scientists posit that the sudden cooling was not a natural climatic wobble, but was triggered by a catastrophic extraterrestrial event. The theory suggests that a comet or asteroid, perhaps breaking up in the atmosphere, slammed into the ice sheet covering North America or exploded above it. The immediate effects would have been apocalyptic. The kinetic energy of the impact would have generated continent-wide firestorms, setting vast forests ablaze. The heat from the impact on the ice sheet would have unleashed colossal floods of meltwater, but the most devastating effect might have been the aftermath. The immense quantities of dust, soot, and water vapor thrown into the atmosphere would have shrouded the entire planet, blocking sunlight and crashing global temperatures for centuries. This impact winter would have decimated the ecosystems the Clovis depended on. The grasslands that sustained the great herds would have died off, leading to a mass extinction of their prey. For the Clovis people, whose entire identity and survival were tied to hunting these giant creatures, it would have been an unsurvivable catastrophe. In a world suddenly devoid of their primary food source and gripped by a never-ending winter, their sophisticated tool-making tradition and way of life simply ceased to exist almost overnight. The debate surrounding this hypothesis, however, is fierce and ongoing. Many in the scientific community urge caution, pointing to a lack of conclusive evidence for a continent-wide impact and arguing that natural climate feedback mechanisms could explain the Younger Dryas cooling. They suggest that the disappearance of the megafauna might have been due to overhunting by the Clovis themselves, the so-called Pleistocene overkill theory, or a combination of hunting pressure and a changing environment. Yet, proponents of the impact theory continue to present evidence, including a thin layer of sediment at sites across the continent that contains nanodiamonds, tiny magnetic spherules, and elevated levels of platinum, materials often associated with cosmic impact. Whether by a blast from the heavens or a more earthly combination of factors, the result was the same. The first widespread human culture in North America, a people of unparalleled skill and adaptability, faced a challenge beyond their comprehension. In the face of a rapidly changing world, their distinct signature faded from the land, leaving behind their beautifully crafted stone points as silent witnesses to a vanished way of life. Leaving the enigmatic Clovis hunters of North America behind, we now journey across the Atlantic and thousands of years forward in time, to the rolling hills and fertile plains of Eastern Europe, where a Neolithic society achieved a scale of community that would not be seen again for millennia. This is the story of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, a name derived from the modern villages in Romania and Ukraine where their remains were first discovered. Flourishing between approximately 5500 and 3500 BCE, they were the undisputed giants of their age, not in warfare or conquest, but in the sheer, breathtaking ambition of their communal living. What they achieved is almost difficult to process. In an era when most of humanity lived in small villages of a few dozen souls, the Tripilians were constructing what can only be described as proto-cities. The largest of their settlements, like the recently discovered Nebelivka in Ukraine, sprawled across an area of over 300 hectares. To put that in perspective, that's more than twice the size of the entire Principality of Monaco. These were not haphazard collections of huts. They were meticulously planned megasites laid out in concentric circles of buildings radiating from a central open plaza, with districts that appear to have been designated for specific crafts or community activities. Their sophisticated longhouses, built with wooden frames and plastered with clay, were arranged along deliberate, curving streets. Current estimates suggest that at their peak, these sprawling metropolises could have been home to between 15 and 20,000 people. For a point of reference, the city of Uruk in Mesopotamia, often hailed as one of the world's first great cities, wouldn't reach a comparable size for another 1,000 years. The Tripilians were pioneers of urban living on a truly staggering scale. Their society was remarkably advanced and stable. They were master farmers, cultivating wheat and barley, and domesticating cattle, sheep, and pigs. They were also exquisite artists, creating a stunning array of pottery painted with intricate spiral and coil motifs in white, red, and black. Designs that seem to pulse with energy and a deep, symbolic meaning we can only guess at. They crafted thousands of clay figurines, most depicting women, which suggests a society where female deities or principles were central to their spiritual worldview. For over 2,000 years, this culture thrived, demonstrating a resilience and a shared cultural identity across a vast territory. But this seemingly idyllic, stable existence is shadowed by one of archaeology's most perplexing rituals. Every 60 to 80 years, without fail, the inhabitants of a Trypillian megasite would do something unthinkable. They would deliberately set their entire city on fire. They didn't just abandon their homes, they systematically burned them to the ground in a controlled, community-wide event. The evidence is found in the archaeological layers, which show not the random ash and charcoal of an accidental blaze, but a consistent, clean layer of fired clay and burned debris covering the entire settlement. The heat was so intense and uniform that it essentially fired the clay-daubed walls of the houses, turning them into literal ceramic bricks and preserving the footprints of the structures perfectly. The reasons behind this ritual conflagration remain one of prehistory's great mysteries. Some anthropologists propose a practical explanation, suggesting the burning was a form of pest control, a way to cleanse the densely populated settlement of vermin, insects, and disease that would have accumulated over a few generations. Others see it as a profound spiritual act. The destruction of the old village may have been a necessary purification rite, a symbolic death that allowed for a spiritual rebirth. The community would then literally build their new city directly on top of the sacred ashes of the old one, maintaining a tangible connection to their ancestors and their history, layering their landscape with meaning over centuries. It was a cycle of death and renewal written in fire and clay, a testament to a worldview completely unlike our own. This cycle of construction and intentional destruction continued for centuries. Then, around 3500 BC, the fires stopped for good. The megasites were abandoned and never rebuilt. The vibrant pottery styles ceased production. The Cucuteni Trypillia culture, after 2 millennia of stability, vanished from the archaeological record. The question of their disappearance is tangled with one of the great population shifts in human history, the expansion of the Yamnaya culture. These were a very different people from the settled agricultural Trypillians. They were pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe to the east, and they possessed a revolutionary technological advantage. They had domesticated the horse and developed wheeled carts. This gave them unprecedented mobility. It's unlikely the Trypillians were wiped out in a wave of violent conquest. Instead, their end was probably more complex and gradual. A changing climate may have played a role, with drier conditions making their extensive agriculture more difficult. The arrival of the Yamnaya, with their herds and their different social structure, could have introduced new pressures, diseases, or conflicts over resources. The most likely scenario is one of absorption and assimilation. The steppe peoples may have moved into the vacuum left by the declining Trypillian centers, and over generations, through intermarriage and cultural exchange, the distinct Trypillian identity slowly faded, its traditions and rituals dissolving into the new cultural currents sweeping across Europe. Their colossal cities were left to be buried by soil and time, their greatest achievement living together in vast numbers, forgotten until archaeologists began to peel back the layers, revealing the ashes of a civilization that chose again and again to rise from its own flames. Yet another civilization that mastered the art of thriving in a harsh environment. The Nabateans carved their legacy not into clay or stone blocks, but directly into the living rock of the desert canyons in what is now Jordan. Emerging as a powerful force by the 4th century BC, they were the undisputed masters of the Arabian incense trade, the gatekeepers of a luxury economy that fueled the rituals and daily life of the ancient world. Frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins harvested from trees in the distant land of modern-day Oman and Yemen, were not merely pleasant perfumes. They were commodities as valuable as gold, essential for religious ceremonies in temples from Rome to Babylon, and for masking the less pleasant aromas of crowded ancient cities. The Nabateans controlled the entire supply chain, from the remote sources in southern Arabia all the way to the Mediterranean ports where these precious goods were sold to Greek, Roman, and Egyptian merchants at an enormous markup. Their wealth and security were funneled into a single, breathtaking location, the impregnable city of Petra, hidden away in a remote desert basin, accessible only through a narrow, winding canyon known as the Siq. This was a natural fortress. The approach alone was a statement of power. Any potential invader would be forced to navigate this serpentine, cliff-lined passage, single file and utterly exposed, making a military assault nearly impossible. But the true genius of Petra was not just its defensive position. It was the Nabateans' miraculous ability to conquer the desert's most relentless enemy, thirst. In a region that receives mere inches of rainfall a year, they engineered a hydraulic system of stunning complexity. They carved channels into the cliff sides to capture every precious drop of rainwater from the surrounding plateaus. They constructed extensive networks of ceramic pipes, terracotta canals, and massive underground cisterns that could hold millions of gallons of water, providing not only for the daily needs of a population of perhaps 30,000, but also for lush gardens and even public fountains, an unthinkable luxury in the midst of an arid wilderness. This water management was the lifeblood of the city, allowing it to bloom as a verdant oasis in a barren landscape. With their wealth secured by trade and their survival guaranteed by engineering, the Nabateans expressed their power through architecture of staggering audacity. Instead of building up, they carved down. Their most iconic structures, like the magnificent treasury and the vast monastery, were hewn directly from the rose-red sandstone cliffs. Skilled artisans would begin at the top of a rock face, carving down story by story, meticulously sculpting intricate Corinthian capitals, dramatic staircases, and ornate funeral urns directly from the living rock. The result was a city of facades, its buildings inseparable from the mountain itself, glowing with a mesmerizing palette of red, orange, and pink hues that change with the movement of the sun. This was more than just a capital. It was a grand display of prosperity designed to awe the wealthy merchants who traveled there to conduct business. For centuries, this strategy worked perfectly. Petra grew rich as the central hub in a global network of luxury trade, but its fate was intrinsically tied to the geopolitical whims of its powerful neighbors. In 106 CE, the Roman Emperor Trajan, seeking to secure this lucrative trade route for himself, formally annexed the Nabatean kingdom, transforming it into the Roman province of Arabia Petraea. Initially, this brought a new wave of Roman investment. Petra was graced with a grand colonnaded street, a massive theater cut into the rock, and other classical monuments. But this incorporation into the Roman Empire ultimately spelled the beginning of a long, slow decline. The Romans were master road builders, and they soon developed new trade routes that bypassed Petra entirely. They favored a route that went from the Red Sea port of Ala modern Aqaba straight north to Damascus, a highway that was easier to patrol and control. Almost overnight, Petra found itself sidelined from the economic bloodstream it had once commanded. The final blow came from a shift in global commerce itself. As sea trade routes between Rome and India became more established and reliable, the demand for the slow, overland caravan journey diminished. The value of frankincense and myrrh also began to wane with the rise of Christianity, a faith that did not rely on vast quantities of burnt incense for its rituals in the same way that pagan religions had. The city's sophisticated water system, its greatest asset, then became its greatest vulnerability. A massive earthquake in 363 CE shattered the carefully engineered channels and cisterns. Without the collective wealth and specialized knowledge to repair the system completely, the city's ability to sustain its population was critically damaged. People began to drift away. By the time of the Arab conquests in the 7th century, Petra was a shadow of its former self, a small provincial town living in the ruins of its own epic past. The Crusaders built a small outpost there in the 12th century, but they too soon left. After that, the city was abandoned to everything except local Bedouin herders who kept its memory alive as a secret legend until Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, disguised as an Arab scholar, convinced them to lead him through the Sick in 1812, reintroducing the lost city of stone to an astonished world. Our journey now takes us to one of the most remote and haunting places on Earth, a tiny speck of land isolated in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean Easter Island, or as its original inhabitants called it, Rapa Nui. The story of the people who settled this volcanic outpost is one of the most gripping and cautionary tales of human ingenuity and, according to a long-held narrative, profound folly. Imagine the sheer audacity of the Polynesian explorers who, sometime around 1200 CE, navigated their great double-hulled canoes across thousands of miles of open ocean, using only the stars, the swell of the waves, and the flight paths of birds as their guides. They found this island rich in resources and began to build a unique and complex society, completely cut off from the rest of the world for centuries. Their most stunning and enduring legacy is, without a doubt, the moai. These are not just simple stone carvings, they are colossal monolithic figures, nearly 900 of them, hewn from compressed volcanic ash at a single quarry at the volcano Rono Raraku. The average moai stands about 13 feet tall and weighs a staggering 14 tons, but the largest one ever erected, named Paro, was over 30 feet tall and weighed closer to 82 tons. The scale is mind-boggling, but the true mystery isn't just how they carved them, it's how they moved these multi-ton giants across miles of rugged landscape and then, somehow, raised them onto massive stone platforms called ahu that line the coast. For a society with no metal tools, no wheels, and no draft animals, this was an engineering project of almost superhuman ambition. The oral traditions of the Rapa Nui people themselves speak of the statues walking across the island. For a long time, Western scholars dismissed this as pure myth, proposing instead that the islanders used a system of log rollers and ropes to drag the moai into position, a method that would have required enormous amounts of timber and hundreds of people. This theory became the cornerstone of a powerful and popular narrative, famously articulated by geographer Jared Diamond. He presented Rapa Nui as the ultimate parable of ecological suicide. The story goes that the island was once covered in a lush palm forest. As the population grew and the competition between clans to build bigger and more moai intensified, they cut down every last tree. No trees meant no canoes for deep-sea fishing, no way to transport statues except by brutal dragging, and eventually catastrophic soil erosion that led to agricultural collapse. The result, according to this view, was a descent into famine, warfare, and cannibalism, a society that literally collapsed under the weight of its own ecological short-sightedness. This narrative is compelling and has been used as a stark warning for our own global society. However, a wave of recent archaeological evidence is challenging this tidy story of self-destruction, painting a far more complex and ultimately more tragic picture. For one, experiments have shown that much smaller groups of people could have moved the moai using a walking motion with ropes, a method that aligns perfectly with the oral history and would have required far less wood. More importantly, analysis of the island's soil suggests the Rapa Nui were not reckless destroyers but brilliant agricultural engineers who used a technique called lithic mulching, covering the soil with broken rocks, to retain moisture and grow crops like sweet potatoes in the poor volcanic soil, effectively sustaining a sizable population. The real catastrophe for the Rapa Nui people likely didn't come from within, but from the outside. The first recorded European contact was with Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen on Easter Sunday in 1722, and it was disastrous from the start. His crew opened fire on a crowd of islanders, killing a dozen. But the true death knell for Rapa Nui culture was sounded in the 19th century. Peruvian slave raiders struck the island repeatedly between 1859 and 1863, kidnapping over 2,000 people, nearly half the island's population, and shipping them to work in the brutal guano mines of Peru. Though international pressure eventually forced Peru to repatriate the survivors, a smallpox outbreak on the return ship meant only 15 ever made it back home, and they brought the disease with them. This series of events decimated the population, shattered the social structure, and destroyed the lineage of elders who held the sacred knowledge of the Moi's meaning and the history of their people. The surviving islanders, traumatized and bereft, were soon after forced onto a single settlement by Christian missionaries who further suppressed their language and traditions. The toppling of the Moi, which Europeans had long assumed was evidence of ancient interclan warfare, now appears to have been a later act of symbolic violence by different groups in this period of immense social upheaval and collapse. The story of Rapa Nui is not a simple tale of a people who failed to live sustainably. It is a far more human story of remarkable adaptation and resilience in the face of incredible isolation, followed by a tragic and abrupt end not from internal failure, but from the devastating impact of external exploitation and disease. The Moi did not cause the collapse, they stand as silent, stoic witnesses to it. From the isolated mysteries of Rapa Nui, we now turn our gaze to the high desert of the American Southwest, where another society carved an improbable civilization from a stark and arid landscape. This is the story of the Ancestral Puebloans, a name preferred by their modern descendants over the older Navajo term Anasazi. Their story is not one of a singular vanishing act, but of a profound and deliberate transformation, a conscious choice to walk away from a grand architectural experiment and redefine what it meant to thrive. The heart of their world between the 9th and 12th centuries was Chaco Canyon in what is now New Mexico. To call this place unforgiving is an understatement. It is a dry, wind-swept basin where rainfall is scarce and precious. Yet, in this seemingly inhospitable environment, the Ancestral Puebloans engineered a flourishing society centered around what we now call great houses. These were not mere villages, they were monumental, multi-storied structures of a scale and complexity unmatched in the region. Pueblo Bonito, the most famous of these, rose 4 or 5 stories high and contained over 600 rooms arranged in a vast D-shaped complex with immense circular, subterranean ceremonial chambers called kivas built into its plazas. The construction is a marvel of pre-Columbian engineering. Workers quarried massive sandstone blocks, shaped them with stone tools, and set them in place with a mortar of mud, creating walls that were often 3 feet thick at the base. They hauled thousands of ponderosa pine logs from forests over 50 miles away to serve as ceiling beams, a logistical feat that speaks to a highly organized and centralized society with the power to command immense labor. But the genius of Chaco was not confined to its architecture alone. This was a culture deeply attuned to the cosmos. Their buildings are precisely aligned to the movements of the sun and moon. A dagger of sunlight would pierce a specific carved spiral on a cliff wall at the exact moment of the summer solstice. Windows and doorways were positioned to mark the lunar standstill, an 18.6-year cycle that few cultures outside of Chaco even recognized. This was not simple stargazing. It was a sophisticated, calibrated celestial science, integrated into the very fabric of their city and almost certainly central to their religious and agricultural cycles. It allowed them to precisely time their plantings and ceremonies in a land where being off by a week could mean the difference between harvest and hunger. Chaco Canyon was far more than a population center. It was the ceremonial, economic, and astronomical capital of a vast network that stretched across the Four Corners region, connected by a radiating web of perfectly straight roads that can still be seen from the air today. For all its grandeur, the golden age of Chaco was relatively brief. By the middle of the 12th century, a profound change was underway. the archaeological record shows a clear and chilling pattern. A severe, decades-long drought began to grip the region. Tree ring data reveals a period of exceptionally low rainfall between 1130 and 1180, a mega-drought that would have pushed an already marginal environment beyond its breaking point. The carefully managed fields of maize, beans, and squash would have withered. The water storage systems that supported the dense population would have run dry. In a place where every drop of water was a victory, this prolonged aridity was a catastrophe. However, to attribute the abandonment solely to drought is to oversimplify a deeply human story. Environmental stress often acts as a catalyst, exposing and exacerbating underlying social fractures. The very concentration of power and resources that built Choco may have become its greatest weakness in the end. As resources dwindled, the authority of the religious and political elite, whose power was likely based on their perceived ability to ensure reign and prosperity, would have been severely undermined. Why follow leaders who could no longer bring the reins? There is some archaeological evidence, including burned rooms and remains showing signs of trauma, that suggests a period of social unrest or conflict may have erupted, perhaps as different groups competed for the dwindling water and food. The story of Choco's end is not one of a people disappearing, but of a society making a conscious and strategic decision to decentralize. They did not vanish into thin air. Instead, they chose to disperse. Gradually, over generations, they migrated away from the great houses of Choco, moving to areas with more reliable water sources, like the foothills of the Rio Grande and the mesas of Arizona. They took their culture, their knowledge, and their traditions with them. Their descendants are the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, who still practice a vibrant culture deeply connected to their ancestral past. The abandonment of Choco Canyon was not a failure. It was an act of incredible resilience and adaptation. They left behind the grand, centralized experiment of Choco to forge a new, more sustainable way of life in smaller, scattered communities, ensuring their culture would endure long after the last light of the solstice slid across the empty walls of Pueblo Bonito. Moving south along the Pacific coast of South America, we encounter a civilization whose artistic brilliance and technological mastery were forged in one of the world's most arid environments, the Moche of ancient Peru. Flourishing between approximately 100 and 800 CE, their domain was a narrow strip of coastal desert, a land where rain might not fall for decades, yet they engineered a society of astonishing sophistication and power. Their most visible monuments are the immense adobe brick pyramids known as huacas that rise from the dusty plains. The two largest, the Huaca del Sol and the Huaca de la Luna, dwarfed all other structures in the region. The Huaca del Sol was a behemoth constructed from an estimated 140 million adobe bricks, many of them marked with symbols thought to represent the labor gangs from different valleys who contributed to its construction. This suggests a highly organized society capable of marshalling a vast workforce for projects of grand, likely religious significance. But the true genius of the Moche wasn't just in their monumental architecture, it was in their ability to conquer the desert itself. They were hydrological masters, engineering extensive networks of canals that snaked across the landscape, some stretching over 60 miles, to siphon water from rivers flowing down from the Andes. These canals fed into meticulously graded fields, creating verdant agricultural oases that supported a population large enough to build those colossal pyramids. They grew maize, beans, squash, and peanuts, and harvested immense riches from the Pacific Ocean, which provided a steady supply of fish and shellfish. This agricultural surplus funded a society of extraordinary artisans. Moche metallurgists were among the finest the ancient world ever produced, crafting stunning objects in gold, silver, and copper using advanced techniques like soldering, gilding, and electroplating. Their ceramicists created some of the most expressive and realistic portrait vessels ever known. capturing individual human faces with a level of detail and emotion that feels strikingly modern, along with intricate vessels depicting deities, animals, and scenes from daily life and mythology. This vibrant, complex society, however, did not simply fade away. Its end appears to have been dramatic and violent, and the key to understanding it lies not in human conflict, but in the very climate system the Moche had learned to harness. Scientists drilling into ice caps in the Andes and pulling core samples from lake and ocean sediments have uncovered a chillingly precise record of the environmental catastrophe that likely befell the Moche. The evidence points to a devastating climatic 1-2 punch, all driven by the erratic cycle of El Niño. The first blow was a period of intense and relentless El Niño activity beginning around the 6th century. An El Niño event for the coastal desert of Peru doesn't mean drought, it means biblical-scale flooding. The warm Pacific waters caused the normally dry rivers to become raging torrents, washing down from the mountains with catastrophic force. The geological record shows layers of sediment deposited by immense floods that would have overwhelmed the Moche's sophisticated irrigation canals, smashing their infrastructure and burying their fertile fields under meters of sterile sand and gravel. This period of catastrophic flooding was then followed by the opposite extreme, a prolonged and severe drought likely lasting for decades. Ice core records from the Quelquea Glacier show a pronounced drought period from around 560 to 650 CE, a generation-long stretch where the rain simply failed in the highlands, meaning the rivers that were the lifeblood of the coast would have dwindled to a trickle. The Moche's entire civilization was built on a delicate hydrological balance, and this climatic whiplash, from devastating floods that destroyed their infrastructure to a deep drought that left their repaired canals empty, would have shattered their agricultural foundation. The result would have been widespread famine, disease, and a complete collapse of the social order. The archaeological evidence at Moche sites powerfully supports this theory. At the Huaca de la Luna, archaeologists have discovered evidence of a final, desperate period. The beautiful murals were covered over with a plain layer of clay, as if the rituals held there had lost their power. More chillingly, the skeletons of dozens of young men have been found in positions suggesting they were sacrificed or executed, their bodies showing signs of extreme trauma and being left exposed to the elements. This suggests a society in crisis where the traditional rulers and priests who derived their authority from their ability to ensure water and plenty were losing control. In a final effort to appease angry gods and restore the natural order, they may have resorted to extreme human sacrifice on a scale never seen before. It wasn't enough. The political and religious framework that had held the Moche world together for centuries fractured. Their capital was abandoned and their culture faded, leaving their magnificent pyramids to slowly melt back into the desert from which they rose, a stark testament to the terrifying power of a climate pushed out of balance. From the coastal deserts of Peru, we now journey to the highlands of the Horn of Africa, where a kingdom rose to such power and prestige that it was counted by a Persian prophet as one of the 4 great empires of the ancient world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. This is the story of the Kingdom of Axum, a beacon of civilization that dominated the crossroads of Africa and Arabia for nearly 1,000 years. At its peak between the 3rd and 6th centuries, Axum was a titan of commerce and culture, a sophisticated state whose influence stretched from the sands of the Nile to the markets of the Indian Ocean. The capital city, also called Axum, was a bustling, cosmopolitan hub, home to a diverse population of traders, artisans, and diplomats. Its power was proclaimed to the world through a truly audacious innovation. It was one of the first polities in the world, and the very first in Africa, to mint its own coins for international trade. These weren't crude imitations, they were beautifully crafted pieces of gold, silver, and bronze, inscribed in Greek and featuring the cross after their conversion, a bold statement of economic confidence and sovereignty that circulated from the Mediterranean to Sri Lanka. But the coins were just one facet of their grandeur. The Axumites expressed their devotion and power in stone, erecting monumental stelae or obelisks that still defy comprehension. The largest of these, now fallen, stood an incredible 110 feet tall, taller than a 10-story building. It was a single piece of solid granite, precision carved to resemble a multi-story tower, complete with false doors, windows, and intricate metal decorations. Quarrying, transporting, and erecting such a monolith was an engineering feat that rivals the construction of the Great Pyramids, a testament to a highly organized society with immense resources and technical skill. These stelae likely served as markers for the underground tombs of Axum's elite, a permanent reminder of a dynasty's power that would echo through the ages. The city itself was adorned with magnificent palaces like the multi-story Taka Mariam, featuring sunken courtyards, intricate drainage systems, and rooms laid with polished stone floors. The kingdom's wealth was built on its strategic grip of the Red Sea trade. Axumite merchants acted as the crucial middlemen in a global network, controlling the flow of luxury goods from the African interior ivory, exotic animal skins, rhinoceros horn, and most importantly, gold, to the insatiable markets of the Roman Empire and beyond. Their massive, sea-going vessels, called navs, sailed to ports in Egypt, India, and the Arabian Peninsula, returning with iron, glassware, wine, and spices. This commercial empire was backed by a powerful navy and army, which allowed them to expand their territory and project their power across the region, even launching a campaign across the Red Sea to conquer parts of the Arabian Peninsula. In the 4th century, under King Azana, the kingdom underwent a profound transformation that would shape the entire region's future. It officially converted to Christianity, becoming one of the very first major Christian states in the world. This wasn't a superficial change. It integrated Axum into the wider Christian world, forging alliances with the Byzantine Empire and establishing a unique religious identity that has endured in Ethiopia for over 1,600 years, making it one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth. For all its strength and sophistication, the fall of Axum was not sudden, but a slow, grinding process of isolation and decay. The first blow was environmental. Centuries of intensive agriculture to feed the growing population, combined with widespread deforestation to provide fuel and building material for the great city, led to severe soil exhaustion and erosion. The very land that had sustained the empire was becoming exhausted. This was exacerbated by a shift in the global climate. Tree ring data and other paleoclimatic records suggest the region was hit by a prolonged period of drier conditions, which would have further reduced agricultural yields and put immense strain on the population. The second, and perhaps more decisive, blow was geopolitical. The rise of Islam in the 7th century fundamentally redrew the map of global trade and power. As Arab-Muslim armies swiftly conquered the Middle East and North Africa, the Red Sea and the routes to the Mediterranean were no longer a neutral zone of Christian commerce. The Axumite kingdom, now a Christian island in a rapidly expanding Muslim sea, found itself economically and politically marooned. The new Islamic empires naturally favored trade routes that ran through their own territories, bypassing the Christian Axumites. The lucrative sea trade that had been the empire's lifeblood began to dwindle, diverting to Persian Gulf routes and other channels controlled by Muslim powers. Axum was gradually cut off from the international economic system it had once helped to define. Its coins, once a symbol of its global reach, ceased to be minted as its influence waned. This economic strangulation led to a slow but irreversible decline. The urban centers, no longer sustained by the wealth of long-distance trade, began to contract. The political power of the Axumite kings faded, and the center of Ethiopian power and culture began a long migration southward, inland to the more defensible and fertile highlands at places like Lalibela. The great capital of Axum was not sacked or destroyed by a foreign invader. It was simply abandoned over generations, its magnificent palaces and stelae left to the elements as the population dispersed into smaller, rural settlements. The kingdom that had once minted coins for the world and erected monuments to the sky did not vanish in a flash, but receded into the highland mists, its political power fading away until all that remained were the silent, towering stelae, enduring monuments to an empire that was slowly, inexorably, forgotten by the outside world it had once so profoundly influenced. Now we travel from the highlands of Axum to the rugged, mountainous heart of Anatolia, where a Bronze Age superpower forged an empire not on open plains but from a fortress of stone. This is the story of the Hittites, a people who emerged from the shadows of history to become one of the ancient world's most formidable military and diplomatic forces. For centuries, their name was little more than a passing reference in the Hebrew Bible and Egyptian records, a mysterious kingdom of the north. It wasn't until archaeologists began deciphering thousands of clay tablets from their capital that the full scope of their power was revealed, a vast empire that stretched from the Aegean coast to the fringes of Mesopotamia, a true rival to the pharaohs of Egypt. The bedrock of Hittite dominance was a technological revolution happening in their foundries, the mastery of iron. While the wider Bronze Age world relied on alloys of copper and tin, the Hittites understood the superior qualities of smelted iron. They developed advanced techniques for forging weapons that were harder, sharper, and more durable than their bronze counterparts. This wasn't just a minor upgrade, it was a monumental military advantage. A Hittite iron sword could hack through a bronze shield, and an iron-tipped spear could pierce bronze armor. So valuable was this technology that the Hittites guarded it as a state secret, a closely held monopoly that gave their armies a terrifying edge on the battlefield. Their kings even presented ceremonial iron daggers as lavish gifts to foreign rulers, a flex of technological prowess that was as much a diplomatic statement as a friendly gesture. But their most terrifying instrument of war was the chariot. The Hittites didn't invent the chariot, but they perfected its use as a shock weapon. Unlike the lighter, faster Egyptian chariots used primarily as mobile archery platforms, the Hittite war chariot was a heavier, sturdier machine. It carried a three-man crew, a driver, a shield-bearer to protect them, and a soldier armed with a thrusting spear or a lance. Deployed in massive formations, these heavy chariots would charge enemy infantry lines to break them apart, creating chaos and openings for the foot soldiers to exploit. This combined arms approach, blending technological superiority with tactical innovation, made the Hittite army nearly unstoppable. Their power was so immense that they clashed with the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II in one of the largest chariot battles in history at Kadesh in 1274 BC. The battle was so brutal and costly for both sides that it ultimately led to a stunning outcome not of total victory, but of mutual respect. The two superpowers negotiated a remarkable document, the Treaty of Kadesh, inscribed on silver tablets. This agreement, which pledged peace and mutual assistance between the two empires, is the earliest known peace treaty in human history, and a copy of it even hangs at the United Nations headquarters today as a symbol of ancient diplomacy. The heart of this powerful empire was the formidable capital, Hattusa. Perched on a rocky plateau in north-central Turkey, it was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. The city was protected by miles of monumental walls, with massive stone foundations topped by superstructures of mud brick. Its gates were guarded by huge, fearsome stone sculptures of lions and sphinxes, designed to intimidate any would-be attacker. Deep underground, hidden beneath the royal citadel, lay a sacred, labyrinthine complex known as the Great Temple, which held not only the state's religious treasures but also its most valuable asset, the royal archives. Here, in room after room, thousands of clay tablets were stored, written in cuneiform script. These tablets preserved everything from royal decrees and legal codes to detailed accounts of military campaigns and intricate religious rituals. They provide us with an incredibly detailed, first-hand account of Hittite government, society, and diplomacy, painting a picture of a highly organized, literate, and complex civilization. Yet, within a shockingly short period, this entire edifice of power came crashing down. Around 1200 BC, the entire Late Bronze Age world, from Greece to Mesopotamia, was consumed by a wave of destruction so widespread and synchronous that historians call it simply the Late Bronze Age collapse. Great cities across the eastern Mediterranean were put to the torch, trade routes disintegrated, and literacy vanished. The Hittite Empire, for all its military might, was right at the epicenter of this cataclysm. The end was swift and brutal. Archaeological evidence at Hattusa shows a city that met a violent end. The grand walls were breached, the city was systematically set ablaze, and the great gates were shattered. Crucially, before they fled or were killed, the inhabitants took the time to hide many of their most important state records, carefully burying the clay tablets in sealed archives, which is why they survived for modern archaeologists to discover. This act suggests they hoped to return, but they never did. Hattusa was completely abandoned, its ruins left to the elements for over 3,000 years. The question of what or who delivered the killing blow remains one of history's great whodunits. One prime suspect is a shadowy coalition of marauders known from Egyptian texts as the Sea Peoples. These groups, their origins still debated, are described as sweeping down from the Aegean and Anatolia, attacking coastlines and overthrowing kingdoms. It's entirely possible a wave of these invaders overwhelmed the Hittite defenses. However, many scholars now believe the Sea Peoples were as much a symptom of the collapse as its cause. Another theory points to internal rebellion. The Hittite Empire was never a monolithic state. It was a patchwork of conquered territories and vassal kingdoms held together by military force and loyalty to the king. A series of weak rulers or a major internal revolt could have fractured the empire from within, leaving it vulnerable. The most compelling explanation, however, may lie in a widespread environmental catastrophe. Tree ring and sediment core data from the period indicates a severe, prolonged drought gripped the region, leading to catastrophic crop failures and famine. A hungry population is a rebellious population, and famine would have shattered the economy that supported the professional Hittite army and the complex state bureaucracy. It was likely a perfect storm. Climate change-induced famine leading to internal unrest, mass migrations of desperate people who may have become the Sea Peoples, and the sudden rupture of international trade networks. The Hittite Empire, for all its iron and chariots, could not withstand the collapse of the entire world it was built upon. The fires that consumed Hattusa marked not just the end of a capital, but the extinction of a superpower, its secrets buried safely in the earth until a new age was ready to hear its story. Leaving the smoldering ruins of Hattusa behind, we cross the Aegean Sea to the rugged, mountainous mainland of Greece, where another powerhouse of the Late Bronze Age met an equally dramatic and mysterious end. This is the world of the Mycenaeans, the people who would later be remembered by the classical Greeks as their heroic, semi-mythical ancestors. From around 1600 to 1100 BC, they dominated the region not as a unified nation, but as a collection of rival kingdoms, each ruled from an immensely fortified palace citadel. The most famous of these, Mycenae, was so massive that later Greeks believed it could only have been built by the mythical Cyclopes, giving rise to the term Cyclopean masonry for the gigantic, irregular limestone blocks that form its walls. These were not just palaces, they were fortresses perched on easily defensible hilltops with walls so thick and gates so imposing, like the famous Lion Gate at Mycenae, that they projected an aura of immense, unshakable power and a constant fear of attack. Within these citadels, a highly centralized and bureaucratic economy thrived, and we know this because, unlike many of their contemporaries, the Mycenaeans left behind a precious written record. Their script, Linear B, was used not for poetry or history but for inventory. Thousands of clay tablets, accidentally preserved when the palaces burned down, detail meticulous records of everything from the number of chariot wheels in storage and the flocks of sheep owned by the palace to the rations given to workers and the offerings made to the gods. Deciphering Linear B in the 1950s was a monumental breakthrough, revealing two crucial facts. First, that the language was a very early form of Greek, proving a direct cultural and linguistic link between these Bronze Age people and the later Greeks of the Classical Age. And second, that their society was dominated by a ruler known as the Wanaks, who oversaw a complex hierarchy. Officials, soldiers, priests, and a vast number of slaves, all documented with bureaucratic precision. This wealth, which required such detailed accounting, was built on extensive trade and, it seems, a knack for strategic warfare. Mycenaean pottery has been found all across the Mediterranean, from Sicily and southern Italy to the coasts of Egypt and the Levant, indicating a far-reaching network of maritime exchange. They traded olive oil, wine, and their beautifully decorated ceramics for luxury goods like amber from the Baltic, ivory from Egypt, and gold from Nubia. Their military prowess is evident in their art, which frequently depicts boars' tusk helmets, figure-8 shields, and scenes of hunting and combat. This martial culture is the very bedrock of the Homeric epics, written down centuries later. The legend of the Trojan War, with Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, leading a coalition of Greek kings to besiege the wealthy city of Troy, is widely believed to be a distorted memory of a real conflict, perhaps a Mycenaean raid or campaign against a rival power controlling the vital trade routes through the Dardanelles. Yet, for all their fortifications, their wealth, and their military might, the Mycenaean world disintegrated with shocking speed. In the span of just a few decades around 1200 BCE, nearly every one of their major palatial centers, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, was violently destroyed by fire and abandoned. This was not an isolated event. It was part of the same widespread late Bronze Age collapse that toppled the Hittites and shattered trade networks from Egypt to Mesopotamia. The archaeological evidence at each site is hauntingly similar, a layer of intense ash and destruction followed by silence. The question of what caused this synchronous downfall has been debated for over a century. One traditional theory points the finger at the same mysterious sea peoples who threatened Egypt. Some speculate that these marauders may have included displaced Mycenaeans themselves, turned to piracy as their own society began to fray, creating a feedback loop of violence that consumed the entire region. Another, more homegrown theory suggests internal upheaval. The incredibly rigid, top-heavy palace economy may have placed too much strain on the common people. A series of poor harvests could have led to famine, sparking widespread revolts against the elite Wanaks and his bureaucrats, with the populace rising up to burn the palaces that had once organized their lives. Perhaps the most compelling explanation, however, lies in a combination of environmental and systemic factors. Paleoclimatic data from the region indicates a period of severe and prolonged drought coinciding perfectly with the collapse. For a society heavily dependent on agriculture to support its centralized palace system, a multi-year failure of crops would have been catastrophic. It would have led to famine, a collapse in tax revenues, and the inability to support the specialized craftsmen, soldiers, and officials that were the backbone of Mycenaean power. This internal weakening would have made them vulnerable to any external shock, whether it was a small band of invaders or simply their neighbors next door. The intricate web of international trade that supplied them with vital metals and luxuries also snapped, cutting off another critical source of their wealth and status. The result was not a replacement of one culture by another, but a total systems failure. With the palaces gone, the knowledge of writing disappeared for centuries. The population dropped dramatically, with many people abandoning the coasts for more defensible but isolated settlements in the mountains. The art of fine pottery and metalworking was lost, and Greece entered a period we call the Greek Dark Ages, a 300-year twilight where society reverted to a much simpler, more local level of organization. The grand palaces, with their meticulous records of chariots and linen, became nothing more than crumbling ruins, their past glory surviving only in the half-remembered myths of a heroic age, sung by bards until a new Greece could eventually emerge from the shadows. And from the fortified citadels of the Mycenaeans, we now venture into one of the most unlikely settings for a powerful civilization, the vast, sun-scorched expanse of the Sahara Desert. It's almost impossible to imagine today, but 2,000 years ago, the world's largest desert was home to a sophisticated and formidable kingdom known as the Garamantes. These were not simple nomadic tribesmen. They were urbanites, master engineers, and a force that even the mighty Roman Empire learned to respect. Their story is a powerful testament to human ingenuity in the face of extreme environmental challenges and a sobering lesson in the limits of even the most brilliant technology. The Garamantes established their heartland in the Fezzan region of modern-day Libya, a landscape that to our eyes appears as nothing but endless, inhospitable dunes. Yet beneath this arid surface lay their greatest treasure, vast aquifers of fossil water. This was not fresh rainfall, but ancient water, trapped in underground rock layers for thousands of years, a relic from a distant past when the Sahara was a green savanna. The genius of the Garamantes was their ability to tap this hidden resource on a massive scale. They constructed a breathtakingly complex network of underground irrigation tunnels known as fagaras or kanats. This was a technology of staggering ambition. They would dig a mother well deep into the aquifer, then tunnel horizontally for miles, following a very slight gradient so that the precious water would flow by gravity to the surface. Shafts were dug at regular intervals along the tunnel's length for construction, maintenance, and ventilation. The scale of this undertaking is almost beyond belief. Over 500 miles of these tunnels have been identified, with some individual fagaras stretching for several miles. This was a public works project that would have required a centralized authority, specialized engineers, and a massive, coordinated labor force to build and maintain. This hydrological masterpiece allowed them to perform what amounted to magic in the desert. They transformed barren basins into lush, green agricultural oases, cultivating dates, figs, barley, wheat, and even grapes. This agricultural surplus was the foundation of everything that followed. It supported a population that grew into the tens of thousands, allowing them to build several sizable capital cities, the greatest of which was Garama. These were not temporary camps. Garama boasted stone-built public buildings, tombs, and fortifications. Their wealth and power, however, were not solely grown from the ground. The Garamantes controlled the crucial trans-Saharan trade routes. Their camel caravans, the lifeblood of desert commerce, transported salt, gold, ivory, and slaves from sub-Saharan Africa north to the Mediterranean coast, where they traded with the Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans. They became so powerful and such a persistent thorn in the side of Rome that the Emperor Septimius Severus finally launched a major military campaign against them, not to conquer their desert territory, but simply to force them into a treaty and secure their cooperation as traders and occasional allies. For centuries, this system created a stable and prosperous civilization, but the very technology that enabled their existence contained the seeds of its own destruction. The fossil water they were mining was not a renewable resource. It was a finite bank account, and they were making massive, continuous withdrawals with no deposits. The slow, inevitable drawdown of the aquifer meant the water table was gradually sinking. As it fell, the Garamantes were forced to dig their mother wells deeper and their horizontal tunnels longer to reach it. Each new generation faced a more difficult and energy-intensive task to maintain the water flow. Maintenance of the existing fagaras became a constant, desperate battle against cave-ins and siltation. Over hundreds of years, the system became increasingly inefficient and costly to run. the decline was not a sudden collapse but a long, agonizing squeeze. As the water flow diminished, the agricultural output shrank. Famine and hardship likely became more common. The population would have begun to decline through starvation, migration, and falling birth rates. This weakening made them vulnerable. Neighboring nomadic groups who were more adapted to the harsh desert environment and less dependent on a fixed water infrastructure began to exert pressure. The great trans-Saharan trade routes may have shifted, bypassing the weakened Garamantian heartland. Without the wealth from trade and the food from their fields, the complex social and political structure that built the Fagaras and managed the cities simply unraveled. The Garamantes did not vanish in a single dramatic event. There was no invading army that wiped them out. Instead, their civilization underwent a gradual but irreversible fade. Their people did not disappear. They likely abandoned the great stone cities and were slowly absorbed through intermarriage and cultural exchange into the wider Berber and Tuareg populations of the Sahara. Their distinct identity dissolved back into the desert from which it had so spectacularly emerged. Today, the ruins of Garama stand in silent, stark testimony to their achievement, surrounded by the absolute barrenness that has returned. Their story is a profound echo of our own modern challenges, a reminder that even the most advanced engineering cannot indefinitely defy the fundamental limits of the natural resources upon which we all depend. Moving from the sun-baked ruins of the Garamantes, we now venture south of the Sahara into the fertile heart of West Africa, where a foundational culture emerged from the mists of prehistory, leaving behind a legacy of breathtaking artistry and technological innovation that continues to puzzle archaeologists today. This is the story of the Nok culture of Nigeria, a civilization that flourished for over 1,000 years, from around 1500 BC to 500 CE. They are named for the modern village where their first artifacts were discovered, but their true name, their language, and the details of their daily lives remain a profound mystery locked away in time. What they did leave behind, however, is an artistic corpus so distinctive and sophisticated that it instantly redefined our understanding of early African civilization. The most striking and defining feature of the Nok is their spectacular terracotta sculptures. These are not simple clay pots or crude figurines. They are life-sized and near-life-sized human and animal forms of astonishing complexity and emotional depth. The sculptures are characterized by their elegant elongation, their intricate hairstyles and jewelry, and most notably, their expressive, triangular-shaped eyes with perforated pupils that seem to hold a deep, inscrutable gaze. The level of artistry is simply breathtaking. We see figures depicted in a state of contemplation, suffering, or authority. Some are seated figures, perhaps rulers or ancestors, adorned with elaborate necklaces and bracelets. Others show people suffering from diseases like elephantiasis, suggesting a society that sought to understand and represent the full spectrum of the human condition, from power to affliction. The technical skill required to fire such large, hollow clay figures without them cracking is immense, pointing to generations of mastered knowledge passed down through specialized guilds of artists. But the Nok were far more than just brilliant artists. They were also technological pioneers. They are among the very earliest people in all of sub-Saharan Africa to have developed sophisticated iron smelting technology. At sites like Taruga, archaeologists have found the remnants of ancient furnaces, complete with Tyre's clay pipes used to funnel air into the furnace to achieve the incredibly high temperatures needed to reduce iron ore into usable metal. This was a revolutionary advancement. Iron tools would have allowed for more efficient clearing of land for agriculture, leading to larger, more stable settlements. Iron weapons would have conferred significant military advantages. The control of this powerful technology, combined with their artistic output, suggests a highly complex and stratified society, likely with a ruling elite, skilled artisans, and a large agricultural base that supported these specialized classes. They were laying the foundational stones for the great West African kingdoms like Benin and Ife that would follow centuries later. Then, around 500 CE, this vibrant, thousand-year-long tradition comes to an abrupt and silent end. The exquisite terracotta sculptures cease to be produced, the iron smelting furnaces grow cold, the Nok culture, in all its distinctiveness, vanishes completely from the archaeological record. There is no evidence of a massive invasion, no layer of ash from a great conflagration that wiped out their cities. The disappearance is so complete and so quiet that it is in many ways more puzzling than a violent end. So what happened to this foundational West African culture? Without written records, archaeologists must piece together the story from environmental data and subtle clues, leading to several compelling theories. One prominent explanation points to a significant shift in climate. The period around 500 CE is known to have been one of environmental transformation in West Africa, with a trend towards increased aridity. A prolonged drought would have placed unbearable strain on an agricultural society, leading to famine, population dispersal, and the breakdown of the social order that supported the artists and blacksmiths. As communities fragmented and migrated in search of more reliable water sources, the complex cultural traditions, including the sculptural style, would have been lost. Another theory suggests a process of absorption and assimilation rather than outright collapse. The Nok may not have disappeared but simply evolved, their population gradually merging with new groups migrating into the region. Their knowledge of ironworking, a supremely practical and valuable technology, would have certainly been adopted and spread by these newcomers. Their artistic styles, however, might have been lost over time, blended into new cultural expressions or abandoned in favor of different traditions. It's a common story in history. A culture's most practical innovations survive while its unique artistic fingerprint fades away through integration. A more unsettling possibility is that the Nok's own success may have contributed to their decline. Their iron smelting required enormous quantities of charcoal, which in turn required the cutting of vast amounts of wood. Centuries of this activity, combined with land clearance for agriculture, could have led to severe deforestation around their core territory. This would have accelerated soil erosion, reduced rainfall retention, and ultimately created a local ecological crisis that made their way of life unsustainable, forcing a gradual abandonment of their homeland and the dissolution of their cultural identity. Whatever the true reason, the Nok left an indelible mark on history, not through grand monuments or written epics, but through the silent, haunting beauty of their sculpted figures, which continue to stare out from the distant past, guarding the secrets of West Africa's first great artistic civilization. Yet another civilization that built its legacy not on conquest, but on commerce and its reputation as a sacred, almost mythical place, was the Dilmun civilization. For over 2,000 years, from around 3000 to 600 BCE, the islands of Bahrain and parts of the adjacent Arabian coast were the heart of a society that the ancient Sumerians of Mesopotamia revered as a holy land and a paradise. In some of the world's oldest written stories, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, Dilmun is described as a pure, clean, and bright land, a place where sickness and death were unknown, a paradise where the sun god Utu rose. This wasn't just poetic fantasy. For the Sumerians, Dilmun was a real, distant, and incredibly important trading partner, the source of rare and luxurious goods that were essential to their economy and culture. The reality of Dilmun, while perhaps not utterly devoid of death, was certainly one of immense wealth and strategic genius. They were the quintessential middlemen of the ancient world. Their location was their greatest asset, positioned perfectly between two titans of the Bronze Age, Mesopotamia to the north and the Indus Valley civilization to the southeast. Dilmunite merchants operated a sophisticated maritime shuttle service. Their sturdy ships would sail to the mouth of the Indus, loading up with coveted goods like carved ivory seals, distinctive black-on-red pottery, and precious carnelian beads. They would then sail up the Persian Gulf to the Mesopotamian ports, where they traded these exotic items for wool, leather, and above all, silver. They also controlled the trade in vital raw materials, most notably copper. While the ore itself likely came from mines in Oman, known as Magan, the Dilmunites seem to have controlled its distribution, smelting it into ingots and shipping it north to Mesopotamia, where the insatiable demand for bronze made copper as valuable as oil is today. This commercial empire left behind one of the most striking and enigmatic archaeological landscapes on Earth. The Dilmun burial mounds, scattered across northern Bahrain, are over 170,000 of these ancient tumuli, low, round hills that form the largest prehistoric cemetery in the entire world. The earliest mounds were simple, but over time they evolved into incredibly elaborate structures for the elite. The most impressive are the royal mounds at Ali, which feature towering, multi-chambered tombs capped with massive limestone blocks. These were not just graves, they were statements of power, wealth, and belief. The deceased were buried with a rich array of goods for the afterlife, including pottery, weapons, and even the occasional stamp seal, which would have been used by a merchant to sign contracts. The sheer scale of this necropolis suggests a large, stable, and prosperous population that practiced its unique funerary rites for centuries, confident in their place in the world and the afterlife. So what happened to this wealthy, stable, and well-connected civilization? Why did Dilmun, after 2 millennia of success, gradually fade from prominence and lose its distinct cultural identity by around 600 BC? The answer lies not in a single catastrophe, but in a slow-motion unraveling driven by forces beyond its control. The first and perhaps most significant factor was a dramatic shift in the geometry of global trade. For centuries, Dilmun's fortune was built on being the indispensable link between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. But around 1900 BC, the Indus Valley civilization, their great trading partner to the east, collapsed. This sudden disappearance of one end of their economic pipeline was a devastating blow, severing a primary source of their wealth and exotic goods. While they adapted by fostering trade with other regions, the loss was irreplaceable. The second major change was environmental. The islands of Bahrain have always been arid, but their prosperity was built on a miraculous natural resource, freshwater. A unique geological phenomenon caused fresh water to bubble up from underground springs in the sea itself, creating vast, life-giving oyster beds. These springs also fed lush date palm gardens on land, creating the paradise described in the myths. Over centuries, however, the water table likely dropped due to natural climate shifts or overuse, causing some springs to fail and salinity to increase in others. This would have damaged the agricultural base and perhaps even impacted the pearl oysters, another key source of wealth, making it harder to sustain the large population that built the great burial fields. The final decisive factor was the rise of new, aggressive imperial powers. By the first millennium BC, the political landscape of the Near East had been completely transformed. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, followed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, began to exert direct military and economic control over the Persian Gulf trade routes. They no longer wanted to deal with independent middlemen. They wanted to control the source. Furthermore, a new naval power emerged, the Phoenicians of the Levant. As master sailors themselves, they began to challenge Dilmun's dominance in long-distance maritime trade. The final straw was likely the ascendancy of the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC. The Persians formally annexed Bahrain, which they knew as Tylos, fully integrating it into their vast provincial system. Under this new political domination, the distinct Dilmunite identity, their unique burial practices, their stamp seals, their economic independence slowly faded away. They were not conquered and destroyed in a day, but rather absorbed. their culture dissolving over generations into the broader tapestry of the Persian Empire and the incoming Arabian influences. The paradise of the Sumerians didn't vanish. It was simply swallowed by the changing tides of history, its memory preserved only in ancient texts and the countless silent mounds that still dot the Bahraini landscape. Now we venture deep into the Neolithic era, to the banks of the Danube River in the Balkans, where a culture flourished with a level of sophistication so startling that it continues to challenge our conventional timelines for the development of civilization itself. This is the story of the Vinča culture, a society that thrived for over a millennium from 5500 to 4500 BCE. What sets the Vinča apart and what has fueled decades of intense debate among archaeologists is a series of artifacts that may represent one of humanity's oldest and most profound leaps, the invention of writing. The physical remains of the Vinča people point to a remarkably advanced and stable society. Their settlements were immense for their time, some covering up to 50 hectares and housing perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people. That's a population density unmatched in Neolithic Europe. The town of Vinča below Brdo, just outside modern Belgrade, is a testament to this, a great tell settlement with layers of habitation stacked over 15 meters high, evidence of continuous occupation for centuries. These were not temporary camps, they were well-established communities of longhouses built with sophisticated wattle and daub construction, often arranged in orderly rows along streets. They practiced advanced agriculture, cultivating wheat and flax, and domesticated animals like cattle and pigs, but their technical prowess went far beyond farming. The Vinča were among the world's very first metallurgists. They weren't just shaping cold native copper, they were smelting it. At their sites, archaeologists have found crucibles, slag, and copper tools, evidence that they had mastered the complex process of extracting metal from ore, heating it to incredibly high temperatures in specially designed furnaces. This wasn't a primitive curiosity, it was a full-fledged Copper Age industry that predates similar developments in the Middle East by centuries. Yet all of this pales in comparison to their most captivating and controversial legacy, the Vinča symbols. Found inscribed on thousands of clay artifacts, figurines, spindle whorls, and especially small, baked clay tablets are a series of highly abstract and standardized markings. These aren't simple pictures of the sun or a tree. They are intricate combinations of lines, swirls, crosses, and chevrons that show clear signs of being made with a consistent technique, and crucially, they are recombined in different sequences. To many experts, this doesn't look like simple decoration or ownership marks. The complexity, repetition, and systematic arrangement of these symbols have led a number of prominent archaeologists and linguists to propose a breathtaking possibility that this could represent a genuine and truly ancient script. If this interpretation is correct, the Vinča symbols would predate the earliest accepted Sumerian cuneiform by over 1,000 years, potentially rewriting the history of writing and, by extension, the very definition of civilization. But herein lies the maddening rub. Despite decades of effort, the Vinča script, if it is one, remains completely undeciphered. We have no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text to act as a key. The inscriptions are too short, and we have no idea what language the Vinča people even spoke. This leaves the symbols suspended in a tantalizing limbo between proto-writing and a full-blown writing system, their meaning locked away, guarding the secrets of their creators' thoughts, beliefs, and perhaps even their history. This profound mystery makes their disappearance around 4500 BC all the more frustrating. Why did this stable, technologically brilliant, and seemingly sophisticated culture vanish? The archaeological record shows a clear break. The large tell settlements were abandoned. The distinct Vinča pottery styles and those enigmatic symbols ceased to be produced. The most widely accepted theory points to a massive migration of new peoples from the Eurasian steppes. These were the Yamaya, pastoralists who had domesticated the horse and possessed wheeled carts, giving them a level of mobility and military potential that the settled, agricultural venture could not match. It's unlikely this was a sudden, genocidal invasion. Instead, it was probably a slower process of infiltration and pressure. The Yamaya's nomadic, pastoralist way of life may have been better suited to a changing climate. Some pollen data suggests the Balkans became cooler and drier around this time, which would have favored grassland for grazing over the venture's cultivated fields. Faced with climate stress, possible resource competition, and the arrival of a culturally different and highly mobile population, the venture way of life likely fractured. Their large villages, once a source of strength, may have become unsustainable. The people didn't vanish, they were probably absorbed through intermarriage and assimilation into the incoming Yamaya culture and other groups, their unique identity and traditions, including whatever meaning those symbols held, dissolving over generations into the new cultural landscape of Europe. The silent tablets were left behind, a permanent enigma from a world that pioneered so much, only to be forgotten before it could ever truly explain itself. High in the thin, arid air of the Andes, where the sky is a deep, piercing blue and the wind whips across the high-altitude plains, lies the shattered capital of a once great empire. This is Tiwanaku, a city that seems to defy both its environment and logic itself. Located 12,500 feet above sea level on the southern shores of Lake Titicaca, this was the spiritual and political heart of a civilization that dominated the central Andes for centuries, long before the Inca ever rose to power. To stand amongst its ruins today is to witness the ghost of a society that achieved the near impossible, building a metropolis of stone and faith in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, only to have it all come crashing down in a mystery that still echoes across the Altiplano. The first thing that strikes any visitor to Tiwanaku is the sheer, otherworldly precision of the stonework. The city's builders were master geometers and engineers, working with a hard, durable andesite stone that they quarried from across the lake. They cut these massive blocks with an accuracy that borders on the supernatural, fitting them together without mortar using a technique known as ashlar masonry. But this wasn't just simple, functional construction. The stones were often cut with complex geometric patterns, L-shaped brackets, tenons, and perfectly concave or convex surfaces that interlocked with neighboring stones with a seam so tight you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. This wasn't just for show. In a region prone to devastating earthquakes, this intricate joinery allowed the walls to flex and sway without collapsing, a testament to a deep, hard-won understanding of their volatile landscape. The monumental architecture they created with this knowledge was designed to inspire awe and reinforce a powerful religious ideology. The centerpiece of the city is the Akapana, a massive, seven-tiered platform pyramid that once likely served as a sacred temple. Its core is a natural hill that was sculpted and faced with beautifully cut stone, and it was equipped with a complex system of stone drains that channeled rainwater from the summit down through each level, a feat of hydraulic engineering that may have symbolized a sacred mountain flowing with life-giving water. Nearby stands the Kalasosaya, a vast rectangular platform that functioned as a celestial observatory. Its gateways and monolithic pillars are precisely aligned to mark the solstices and equinoxes. On the winter solstice, the sun would rise directly through the center of its famous Gateway of the Sun, a towering monolithic arch carved with a complex and haunting central figure believed to be a celestial deity, often called the staff god, surrounded by rows of winged attendants. This intimate connection between architecture and astronomy reveals a culture profoundly in tune with the cosmos, using the movements of the heavens to dictate the rhythms of ritual and agriculture. But the true genius of the Tiwanaku Empire wasn't just in its ceremonial centers. It was in its ability to feed a vast population in an environment where conventional agriculture should have failed. The Altiplano is a harsh master. Frost is a constant threat, the soil is often poor, and the seasons are unpredictable. The Tiwanaku response to this challenge was nothing short of revolutionary. They invented a system of raised field agriculture, or suka-kolas, on a scale never before seen. On the vast plains surrounding Lake Titicaca, they dug a network of shallow canals, piling the excavated soil to create long, wide planting beds that stood several feet above the water table. This simple yet brilliant innovation created a profoundly resilient microclimate. The canals surrounding each bed acted as heat sinks, absorbing the sun's warmth during the day and radiating it back over the crops at night, protecting the sensitive potatoes, quinoa, and maize from the killing frosts that are common at that altitude. The canals also provided a constant source of moisture and were used to cultivate aquatic plants, which in turn decomposed to create a rich, nutrient-dense mulch that could be dredged up to fertilize the fields season after season. This system was so productive that it could yield 2 to 3 times more food than traditional dry land farming in the same area, supporting an urban population at Tiwanaku that archaeologists estimate may have been as high as 70,000 people at its peak, alongside a wider regional empire connected by a network of roads and outposts. For over 500 years, this system of spiritual authority, architectural grandeur, and agricultural brilliance created a stable and expansive state. Then, around 1000 CE, something went terribly wrong. The archaeological record shows a clear and chilling pattern of decline. Construction on the great monuments ceased. The fine pottery, with its distinctive polychrome designs, becomes cruder and less widespread. And then, the city itself was abandoned. The evidence points overwhelmingly to a climatic catastrophe, a prolonged and devastating megadrought that gripped the region for decades, perhaps even a century. Core samples taken from the bottom of Lake Titicaca and from glaciers in the nearby Andes tell a story of a dramatic and sustained drop in rainfall. The lake level itself is estimated to have fallen by a staggering 30 to 50 feet, retreating miles away from the former shoreline. This climatic shift would have been absolutely catastrophic for the Tiwanaku way of life. Their entire agricultural system, the very foundation of their empire, was predicated on a stable water table. As the rains failed year after year and the lake shrank, the intricate network of canals that fed the suka-kolas would have dried up. The protective thermal mass of the water vanished, leaving the crops exposed to the brutal frost. The fertile aquatic plants died, cutting off the supply of natural fertilizer. The raised fields, once a marvel of productivity, became barren, raised islands in a desert of dried mud. Famine would have swept through the population. The social contract, which was likely based on the elite's perceived ability to intercede with the gods for rain and agricultural abundance, would have shattered. In the face of such an unending crisis, the authority of the priests and rulers in the ceremonial center crumbled. What followed was not a sudden invasion, but a slow, agonizing dissolution. The population, starving and disillusioned, likely broke into smaller, competing groups. There is some evidence of violence and conflict in the final period, but the primary response seems to have been a massive, organized migration. People abandoned the great capital and the Altiplano heartland, dispersing into the more humid mountain valleys to the east where rainfall was more reliable. The Tiwanaku state, as a political and cultural entity, ceased to exist. Its people did not vanish. They became the ancestors of the Aymara-speaking communities that still live in the region today. But the grand unifying ideology, the artistic traditions, and the complex social structure that built the gateway of the sun and fed a metropolis from raised fields faded into memory. The city of Tiwanaku was left to the wind, a stark and powerful monument to a brilliant civilization that mastered its world, until the world it had mastered fundamentally and irrevocably changed. Leaving the high-altitude mysteries of Tiwanaku behind, we now journey across the Pacific to the Korean peninsula, where a kingdom emerged that would shape the very identity of a nation for a millennium. This is the story of the Silla Kingdom, a civilization that combined martial prowess with breathtaking artistic refinement and profound spiritual depth to achieve what no other had done before: the unification of the Korean peninsula under a single rule. Alongside their rivals Baekje and Goguryeo, Silla was one of the three kingdoms of Korea, but it would ultimately outlast and outmaneuver them all. From their capital at Gyeongju, in a basin surrounded by sacred mountains, the Silla kings presided over a society that was both fiercely disciplined and astonishingly creative, a duality that defined their golden age. The most immediate and dazzling legacy of Silla is their masterworking of gold. Their artisans created objects of such delicate beauty and technical sophistication that they remain unmatched in Korean history. The opulence of the Silla elite is spectacularly illustrated by the finds from their royal burial mounds, great grassy tumuli that dot the center of Gyeongju. When archaeologists carefully excavated these tombs, they uncovered a veritable treasure trove that brought ancient legends to life. They found exquisite gold crowns, not as solid circlets but as delicate, airy structures of finely cut sheet gold. These crowns are intricate forests in miniature, adorned with spangles and jade gogok pendants that would have shimmered and tinkled with the wearer's every movement. Branch-like antlers and tree-like motifs rise from them, symbols of a shamanistic belief in a connection between the earthly ruler and the spirit world. Alongside these crowns were belts of heavy, patterned gold plates, ornate earrings that dangled to the shoulders, and perfectly crafted gold vessels. This was more than just wealth on display. It was a sacred regalia designed to project the divine authority and cosmic power of the Silla monarch, the Maripgan, who was seen as a central link between heaven and earth. Yet for all their earthly splendor, the Silla kingdom was undergoing a profound spiritual transformation that would eventually eclipse these ancient shamanistic traditions. In the 6th century, the kingdom officially embraced Buddhism, a momentous decision that was strategically championed by the monarch's advisors as a way to strengthen central state power and align Silla with the sophisticated continental cultures of China. The impact was revolutionary. Buddhism didn't just add a new god to the pantheon, it ushered in a complete cultural and intellectual renaissance. Gyeongju was transformed into a city of temples, with pagodas piercing the sky and the sound of chanting monks replacing older rituals. The most famous of these temples, Bulguksa and the nearby Seokgyoram Grotto, represent the absolute pinnacle of East Asian Buddhist art. The grotto is an artificial cave temple housing a majestic, serene statue of the Buddha gazing out over the Sea of Japan, carved from white granite with such humanity and grace that it seems to breathe. The temple complex of Bulguksa, with its intricate stone pagodas and bridges symbolizing the journey to enlightenment, reflects a deep philosophical commitment to creating a Buddhist paradise on earth. This spiritual fervor was matched by a thirst for celestial knowledge. Silla astronomers were preeminent scientists in their day. They constructed the Cheomseongdi Observatory in Gyeongju, one of the oldest surviving astronomical observatories in the world. This elegant, bottle-shaped stone tower is a masterpiece of simple functionality, with a window aligned to capture the sun's rays at the equinox and a system of internal platforms that allowed stargazers to track the movements of the heavens with remarkable precision. Their meticulous observations allowed them to create accurate calendars, essential for agricultural planning and for scheduling the complex rituals of the Buddhist liturgical year. This scientific pursuit was not separate from their faith but deeply integrated with it, a way to understand the orderly cosmos governed by the universal laws the Buddha had taught. The true catalyst for Silla's golden age, however, was unification. In a series of brilliant and often ruthless military and diplomatic maneuvers throughout the 7th century, Silla kings forged an alliance with the mighty Tang dynasty of China to first subdue the kingdoms of Baekje and Goguryeo. Then, in a final masterstroke, they turned on their Tang allies and expelled them from the peninsula, achieving for the first time a unified Korean state under their sole control in 668 CE. This unified Silla period that followed was an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity. With the internal wars over, culture and trade flourished. Gyeongju became one of the world's great cities with a population said to approach 1 million. It was a cosmopolitan center where Confucian scholars administered a centralized government, Buddhist philosophers debated, and merchants traded with lands as far away as the Middle East. But the very system that created this golden age contained the seeds of its own decay. The Silla state was built on a rigid aristocratic social structure known as the bone rank system. This was a hereditary caste system that dictated one's entire life path, the government office one could hold, the size of one's house, and even the color of one's clothes based solely on the rank of one's birth. For centuries, this system provided stability, but over time it bred intense resentment among the lower-ranked elites and the common people, who were permanently locked out of power no matter their talent or merit. As the central authority of the monarchy began to wane in the 9th century, these powerful regional lords, known as Hojok, began to assert their own independence, raising private armies and withholding taxes from the capital. The kingdom was also rocked by a series of devastating natural disasters and famines, which were interpreted by the populace as a sign that the ruling house had lost the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule. Peasant rebellions erupted across the countryside, further fracturing the state. Into this power vacuum stepped a revived Goguryeo successor state called Later Goguryeo and a revived Beach, plunging the peninsula into a bloody period known as the Later Three Kingdoms. The Silla court, now a shadow of its former self, clung to a hollowed-out ceremonial authority but held no real power. In a final, symbolic act, the last Silla king voluntarily surrendered his authority to the founder of the new Goryeo dynasty in 935 CE, effectively ending Silla's nearly 1,000-year reign. The great capital of Gyeongju was gradually abandoned, its grand palaces and temples falling into ruin and being slowly buried by the soil of time. The memory of its artistic achievements, its gold crowns, and its astronomical prowess faded into local legend. For centuries, the Silla kingdom was little more than a footnote in history, its grandeur waiting silently beneath the green, rounded burial mounds until modern archaeology began to excavate its secrets, revealing the lost splendor of the first unified Korea and reminding the world of a civilization that brilliantly wove together the threads of war, art, and faith to create a golden age would never be forgotten again. Far to the south of Egypt, in the land known today as Sudan, a kingdom of immense power and sophistication emerged, one that would not only challenge its mighty northern neighbor but conquer it outright. This is the story of the Kingdom of Kush, a Nubian civilization whose narrative is often relegated to a footnote in Egypt's story, but which deserves to be told as a magnificent epic in its own right. For centuries, Kush existed in the shadow of the pharaohs, at times a vassal, at times a trading partner, and often a prized target for Egyptian military campaigns seeking the gold, ivory, and ebony that flowed from the Nubian heartland. The Egyptians built massive fortresses along the Nile to control this region, but they could never extinguish the independent spirit of the Kushite people. In the 8th century BC, the tables turned in a dramatic and unprecedented fashion. A series of powerful Kushite kings, beginning with Kashta and culminating with his son Pi, looked north and saw an Egypt fractured, weak, and divided among petty warlords. Seizing the moment, Pi launched a full-scale invasion from his capital at Napata, near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, which the Kushites believed was the southern home of the god Ammon. Pi was not a raider, he was a devout man on a holy mission, appalled by the decadence and disunity of the Egyptian rulers. His campaign, documented in a magnificent victory stela, was one of ruthless efficiency and shocking speed. One by one, the Egyptian cities fell to his armies until he finally captured Memphis, the traditional capital of Egypt. Rather than simply looting and leaving, Pi did the unthinkable. He had himself crowned as the pharaoh of a unified Egypt, founding the 25th dynasty. For nearly a century, the Kushite pharaohs, including the famous Taharqa, ruled a combined empire stretching from the Mediterranean Sea deep into the heart of Africa. They initiated a grand renaissance of Egyptian art, religion, and culture, consciously modeling themselves on the great pharaohs of the Old and Middle Kingdoms and building and restoring temples from Thebes to the Delta. Eventually, military pressure from the expanding Assyrian Empire with its superior iron weaponry forced the Kushites to retreat south, but they did not fade into obscurity. They simply moved their capital further up the Nile to the city of Meroe, and there they entered a new golden age entirely of their own making. Meroe became the engine of a unique and vibrant civilization that brilliantly blended Egyptian influences with a distinctly African character. The most striking symbol of this is the royal cemetery at Meroe. Here, the Kushite kings and queens constructed hundreds of their own pyramids. While smaller and steeper than their Egyptian predecessors, they possess a stark, elegant beauty that is unforgettable. Crowded together on the desert ridges, these narrow structures with their distinctive offering chapel entrances create a skyline unlike any other on Earth, a powerful testament to a kingdom that had fully come into its own. But the true power of Meroe lay not just in its monuments but in its industry. The Kushites became one of the ancient world's industrial powerhouses, and the key to this was iron. The landscapes around Meroe are not littered with the ruins of palaces, but with the remnants of massive furnaces. The city was built atop huge deposits of iron ore and was surrounded by vast forests of acacia trees, which provided the perfect fuel for smelting. The Kushites mastered large-scale iron production, and the skies over Meroe would have been constantly filled with the smoke of countless bloomeries. They produced weapons, to be sure, but also tools, hoes, plowshares, and axes that would have increased their agricultural output and driven their economy. For a time, Meroe was the crucible of Africa, its name becoming so synonymous with ironworking that in later legends, it was even suggested as a possible location for the mythical forge of Hephaestus. This very success, however, contained the seeds of a slow-burning crisis. The industry that made Meroe rich was incredibly resource-intensive. To feed their furnaces, the Kushites needed a constant and enormous supply of charcoal, which required the systematic clearing of the acacia forests. Centuries of this deforestation would have had a catastrophic domino effect. Without the deep root systems of the trees to anchor it, the topsoil would have been vulnerable to erosion during the Nile's annual floods. This would have led to decreased agricultural yields, making it harder to feed the urban population. The environmental degradation, likely coupled with a shift in climate towards greater aridity, would have slowly strangled the economic and agricultural base of the kingdom. At the same time, the world around them was changing in ways that further isolated Meroe. The rise of the Roman Empire and its control over Egypt disrupted the ancient trade routes that had long been a source of Kushite wealth. New maritime routes through the Red Sea, championed by the rising power of Aksum to the east, began to bypass the Nile corridor entirely. The Kushites, once the middlemen of a continental trade network, found themselves increasingly sidelined. The final blows were both military and political. Aksum, a kingdom growing in confidence and power, began to press inward from the coast. An inscription by the Aksumite king Azona boasts of a campaign where he destroyed Meroe, though archaeologists believe this was likely an outpost rather than the capital itself. The attack, however, signals the shifting balance of power. Weakened from within by environmental pressure and from without by economic isolation and military threats, the kingdom of Kush fractured. The central authority in Meroe dissolved, and the region splintered into smaller, weaker polities. In this power vacuum, a new kingdom emerged to the north, Nobatia. It was this Christianized Nubian state that gradually absorbed the remnants of the once great Kushite civilization, not through violent conquest, but through a slow process of cultural and political assimilation. The furnaces of Mara grew cold, its distinct hieroglyphic script was forgotten, and the silent, steep-sided pyramids stood alone in the desert, monuments to an African empire that had dared to rule the world of the pharaohs, only to be ultimately consumed by the land it had so masterfully exploited. What truly sets the Cucuteni Tripilia culture apart and fuels endless fascination is the profound mystery of their social structure and their breathtaking ritual of renewal. The sheer number of female figurines discovered at their sites is staggering. Thousands upon thousands have been unearthed. These are not crude fetishes, they are sophisticated, stylized sculptures, often emphasizing hips, breasts, and buttocks, and frequently found in contexts associated with ovens, hearths, and what appear to be domestic altars. This overwhelming archaeological evidence has led many scholars to propose that Tripilian society was likely matrilineal, if not outright matriarchal. In this framework, lineage and inheritance would have been traced through the mother's line, and women would have held central roles in both the spiritual and economic life of the community. The figurines themselves are thought to represent a powerful mother goddess, a deity of fertility, agriculture, and the hearth, the very foundations of their settled agricultural existence. This stands in stark contrast to the later, warrior-oriented patriarchal societies that would sweep into Europe from the steppes, suggesting a much different and perhaps more egalitarian social world in Neolithic times. But this seemingly stable, goddess-worshipping society is completely defined by one of the most radical and perplexing rituals in all of human prehistory, the deliberate, systematic burning of their own settlements. This was not an act of war or accident. The evidence is unmistakable and consistent across dozens of sites. Every 60 to 80 years, the entire community would gather and set their village ablaze in a controlled, ceremonial conflagration. The heat was so intense and uniform that it literally fired the clay-daubed walls and floors of their wattle and daub homes, turning them into ceramic-like slabs that preserved the perfect imprint of every post hole, every clay oven, and every floor plan for archaeologists to find millennia later. They would then carefully level the scorched ruins and build their new city directly on top of the sacred ashes of the old one, creating the massive stratified mounds or tells we see today. Theories for this astonishing practice are as varied as they are compelling. One pragmatic explanation is pest control. After generations of living in densely packed communities, infestations of insects, rodents, and parasites in the walls and thatch would have become unbearable. A controlled burn would have been the most effective way to purify the site, cleansing it of disease and vermin before rebuilding a healthy new village. Others see it as a form of structural renewal. The fired clay floors and lower walls created a more durable, moisture-resistant foundation for the new structures built atop them. Yet the scale and consistency of the burning point to something far deeper than mere practicality. This was almost certainly a profound spiritual act. The cycle of destruction and rebirth would have been a powerful metaphor for the rhythms of nature they depended on, the death of the old crop and the sowing of the new, the setting and rising of the sun. By ritually destroying their village, they were participating in this cosmic cycle, purifying their community spiritually and ensuring its renewal for another generation. The old village had absorbed the spiritual energy, the joys, and the sorrows of its inhabitants. Burning it may have been seen as a way to release those spirits before starting anew. This practice created a powerful, tangible connection to their ancestors, literally building their present upon the layered history of their past. This magnificent, centuries-long cycle of ritual renewal, however, may have also been their greatest vulnerability. The enormous collective effort required to rebuild an entire megasite every few generations would have demanded incredible social cohesion and a massive surplus of labor and resources. This was a society all in on a specific, incredibly demanding worldview, When the climate began to shift and become drier, and when new, highly mobile pastoralist peoples from the steppes began to appear on the horizons, the Cucuteni Tripilia culture was perhaps too entrenched in its cyclical traditions to adapt quickly. The very ritual that had sustained them for 2 millennia may have locked them into a pattern that was ill-suited to a rapidly changing world. Their immense fixed tells, representing millennia of investment, could not be easily abandoned while the newcomers were defined by their mobility. The culture that mastered the cycle of life, death, and rebirth through fire ultimately found itself unable to escape the cycle of history itself. Their mastery of the sea was nothing short of legendary, forming the very backbone of their economic and political power. The Minoans constructed a fleet of ocean-going vessels that were the marvel of their age, known to the Egyptians as the Keftiu ships. These were not the simple, hide-bound boats of earlier times, but sophisticated wooden ships with high prows and sterns, driven by great square sails and banks of oarsmen. Their sturdy design allowed them to traverse the often treacherous waters of the Mediterranean, venturing far beyond the site of their mountainous island home. This naval prowess allowed them to establish a thalassocracy, a maritime empire controlling not through military conquest and occupation, but through a web of trade, cultural influence, and likely the implied threat of their powerful fleet. They set up trading posts and emporia across the Aegean islands, on the coast of Anatolia, and as far afield as the Levant and Egypt, creating a vast economic network. Their ships carried exquisite goods that became their signature exports. The magnificent Khmerware pottery, with its vibrant, swirling designs on a black background, prized saffron harvested from the crocus flowers that bloomed on their terraced hillsides, and finely crafted bronze weapons and tools. In return, they brought back the raw materials their island lacked: copper from Cyprus, ivory from Syria, gold from Egypt, and the precious tin needed to alloy with copper to create bronze. This control of the bronze trade, in particular, would have given them immense leverage over their contemporaries, making them the indispensable economic engine of the Eastern Mediterranean. This image of a wealthy, powerful, and sophisticated island civilization, suddenly brought low by a cataclysmic natural disaster, has fueled one of history's most enduring and captivating legends, the story of Atlantis. The philosopher Plato, writing over 1,000 years after the thorough eruption, described a powerful island kingdom beyond the Pillars of Hercules that was swallowed by the sea, in a single day and night of misfortune. While most scholars agree Plato likely used the story as a philosophical allegory about hubris, the parallels with the Minoan civilization are striking and impossible to ignore. Thera's eruption was a multi-stage cataclysm. The initial volcanic explosion was so violent it caused the center of the island to collapse into the emptied magma chamber, creating a massive caldera that was instantly flooded by the sea. This sudden collapse would have generated a tsunami of unimaginable scale, a series of titanic waves radiating outward. For the Minoans on Crete, just 70 miles to the south, the experience would have been truly apocalyptic. Imagine the earth shaking violently for days, a colossal plume of ash darkening the sky, turning day into night and blanketing the island in a suffocating layer of volcanic dust. Then the sea itself would have retreated, followed by a wall of water hundreds of feet high smashing into the northern coast, the very heartland of the Minoan civilization. Their proud fleet, the source of their wealth, would have been splintered and sunk at Angkor. Their coastal palaces, towns, and agricultural fields would have been scoured away by the waves and buried under sediment. It is a scenario that matches the Atlantis legend with an eerie precision, suggesting that the memory of this real-world catastrophe, passed down through generations and across cultures, may have been the seed from which Plato's powerful myth eventually grew. Yet, for all the violence of their downfall, the Minoan spirit refused to be entirely extinguished. While their political power was broken and their palaces never again functioned as administrative centers, their cultural DNA was woven deeply into the fabric of the emerging Mycenaean Greek civilization that supplanted them. The Mycenaeans, who took control of Knossos and other sites, were not mere destroyers. They were also ardent admirers and imitators. They adopted the Minoan linear, a script, and adapted it to write their own language, creating what we call Linear B. Through these deciphered tablets, we see that they retained the complex palatial bureaucracy of the Minoans, using it to manage their own economies. Architecturally, the core layout of the Megaron, the central hall of a Mycenaean palace, may have its roots in earlier mainland structures, but the overall plan of the palaces, with their labyrinthine corridors, central courts, and elaborate storage magazines, is profoundly Minoan in concept. The love of vibrant art, especially frescoes depicting nature and ritual, was enthusiastically adopted by Mycenaean elites, though their style became more formal and focused on martial themes. Most significantly, the Minoan religious world seeped into the very bedrock of Greek mythology. The potent symbol of the double-headed labyrinth or ritual axe found throughout Minoan sites likely gave its name to the labyrinth of later myth. The terrifying Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull monster imprisoned within, is a direct echo of the Minoans' powerful and likely dangerous bull-leaping rituals. The figure of Ariadne, the clever princess who guides the hero Theseus through the maze with a thread, may be a dim memory of a Minoan goddess or priestess associated with pathways and salvation. Even the great Zeus, king of the Greek gods, has a childhood myth set in a cave on Crete, suggesting the island was already considered a deeply sacred place. The Minoans bequeathed to later Greece not just administrative tools and artistic styles, but a rich tapestry of symbols, rituals, and stories that the Greeks would make their own, ensuring that the legacy of this first great European civilization would live on long after its dazzling cities had fallen into silence. Their intellectual achievements are perhaps most staggering when we look to the heavens. Without telescopes, metal tools, or any of the instruments we associate with astronomy, the Maya developed a body of celestial knowledge that was arguably the most advanced in the ancient world. Their observations were not casual. They were meticulously recorded by generations of priest astronomers in codices, and these observations spanned centuries, allowing them to discern patterns invisible within a single human lifetime. They calculated the solar year to be 365.2420 days, a figure even more precise than the Gregorian calendar we use today. They could predict solar eclipses with remarkable accuracy and track the complex 584-day cycle of Venus with such precision that they scheduled the declarations of war to coincide with its first appearance as the morning star, believing the god associated with the planet would bring them fortune in battle. This profound celestial understanding was encoded into a system of timekeeping of breathtaking complexity. The Maya didn't have one calendar, they had several, all interlocking like gears in a cosmic machine. The two most important were the 260-day sacred round, known as the Tzolk'in, and the 365-day vague year or Hab. The Tzolk'in was used for religious ceremony and divination, a cycle of 20-day names combined with 13 numbers. The Hab was the civil calendar for agricultural and seasonal cycles. But these were just the beginning. To track longer periods of history, they used the long count calendar, a linear count of days from a mythical starting point they believed corresponded to August 11th, 3114 BC in our calendar. This system counted time in nested units. 20 days made a uinal, 18 uinals made a ton, a 360-day year, 20 tons made a katon, and 20 katons made a bakton, a cycle of 144,000 days, or roughly 394 of our years. It was the completion of a 13th bakton cycle on December 21, 2012 that sparked a global frenzy of modern doomsday predictions. In reality, the Maya saw this not as an end but a turning over of the cosmic odyssometer, a transition from one great cycle to the next, much like our own New Year's Eve. The fact that this esoteric calculation from a collapsed civilization captured the modern world's imagination is a testament to the sheer intellectual power of their calendrical science. This creates a fascinating and poignant paradox. How could a society with the intellectual capacity to chart the cosmos for millennia with such precision fail to foresee and prevent its own collapse? Their astronomical knowledge was a tool for maintaining order, for aligning human activity with the perceived will of the gods and the rhythms of nature. But it was not a tool for solving the gritty, earthly problems of political fragmentation, environmental degradation, and social unrest. The very precision of their calendars may have even contributed to a dangerous rigidity. Their worldview was cyclical and deterministic, suggesting that events were destined to repeat. This could have fostered a sense of fatalism among the ruling elite when faced with the unprecedented, multi-generational drought and the ensuing crises. If the gods had ordained this suffering as part of a grand cycle, what could mere kings do to stop it? Their incredible knowledge, which allowed them to predict the movements of Venus across the sky, offered no solutions for failed crops, no answers for a starving populace, and no way to mend the fractured alliances between city-states that erupted into total war. The Maya collapse stands as a powerful reminder that the highest intellectual achievement is no shield against ecological reality and social fragility, a lesson etched into the ruins of their silent, star-aligned temples. To truly grasp the genius of the Indus Valley civilization, you have to look down beneath the streets to a network of technology that wouldn't be rivaled for thousands of years. In an era when most of the world was drawing water from communal rivers or wells, the Harappans had perfected a system of personal and public water access that is nothing short of astonishing. Each individual house, from the largest courtyard home to the more modest dwellings, was equipped with its own private well. This wasn't a luxury for the elite. It was a standard feature of urban living, ensuring a constant, clean water supply for every family and eliminating the daily struggle that defined life in other contemporary cities. But the true marvel was what happened to the water after it was used. The Indus Valley people were the undisputed masters of wastewater management. The cities were crisscrossed with a comprehensive system of covered drains, built from precisely fitted bricks and laid out with a deliberate, gentle gradient to ensure everything flowed. These drains ran beneath the main streets, connecting to smaller channels that carried waste and rainwater away from individual homes. Each house had a dedicated bathing area with a sloped floor that drained into the street's subterranean system. And perhaps most impressively, they featured the world's first known examples of what we now call manholes, covered access points at regular intervals that allowed for the maintenance and cleaning of the entire network. This was a public health infrastructure project of staggering ambition, designed to keep the city clean and prevent the spread of disease, a concern that wouldn't be systematically addressed again until the height of the Roman Empire. The centerpiece of this hydraulic civilization was the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, a structure that continues to baffle and impress archaeologists. This was a large, waterproofed pool built with finely fitted bricks and a thick layer of natural tar to prevent leaks, surrounded by a colonnade and rooms that suggest it was used for elaborate public rituals or bathing ceremonies. It was fed by water from a large well in an adjacent room, and it had a corbelled drain to allow for efficient emptying and cleaning. The Great Bath stands as a powerful symbol of a society that didn't just manage water for survival, but elevated it to a central part of their civic and possibly spiritual identity. This incredible system was undoubtedly a key to their longevity, supporting a dense urban population in good health for centuries and creating a standard of living that was simply unimaginable anywhere else on the planet at the time. Yet, this very dependency on a perfectly managed water cycle may have also been their greatest vulnerability. Their entire agricultural and urban existence was predicated on the predictable behavior of the Indus River and its tributaries, fed by the reliable monsoon rain. The leading theory for their decline points to a catastrophic breakdown of this hydrological balance. Paleoclimatic data from the region suggests a period of significant climate change began around 1900 BC. The monsoons that filled the rivers likely began to weaken and shift, leading to prolonged and devastating droughts. The Gagahakra River, which many scholars believe was the sacred Saraswati River mentioned in later Vedic texts and was the lifeblood of many Harappan settlements, may have simply dried up, its waters retreating as the glaciers that fed it shrank. Conversely, there is also evidence of devastating floods. A civilization that mastered water would have been skilled in irrigation, but if the climate became more erratic, they could have faced a horrific whiplash periods of drought that starved their fields, followed by catastrophic floods that breached their carefully built embankments and drowned their cities in silt and mud. This environmental pressure would have crippled the agricultural surplus that supported their urban centers and their non-farming specialists, the potters, bead makers, and administrators. As the system broke down, the social contract that held this seemingly egalitarian society together would have frayed. People would have begun to abandon the great cities in search of more reliable water sources, migrating east toward the Ganges basin in smaller, simpler communities. The sophisticated urban experiment, so dependent on a stable climate, simply unraveled when that stability vanished, and this is where the ache of their silence is most profound. Without their texts, we can only guess at how they understood this catastrophe. What did their priests and leaders do as the rains failed and the rivers changed course? Did they perform rituals at the Great Bath, pleading with their gods for the water to return? Did they record prophecies of doom or songs of lament on the very tablets we cannot read? The absence of grand temples and royal palaces suggests a society less focused on deifying a single ruler and more on the collective well-being, a concept embodied by their shared waterworks. Their missing scriptures might have revealed a philosophy of community and harmony with nature, a detailed understanding of hydrology, or epic tales of their own history. Instead, we are left with the silent, empty drains and the dust-dry wells, the haunting infrastructure of a civilization that learned to conquer water, only to be ultimately defeated by its absence. For generations, the central mystery of Easter Island has been the seemingly impossible journey of the Moe. How did a people with no wheels, no metal, and no large animals move these multi-ton giants from the inner quarry at Rono Raraku to their ceremonial platforms, or ahu, often miles away across rugged terrain? The oral traditions of the Rapa Nui people themselves held the answer all along. They said the statues walked. For a long time, Western explorers and scholars dismissed this as pure myth, favoring a more practical, albeit grim, explanation. The dominant theory, popularized in the 20th century, was that the islanders used a system of log rollers. This method would have required felling enormous trees to create a track, upon which the statue would be laboriously dragged by teams of hundreds of people using ropes. This idea became the cornerstone of the ecological collapse narrative, as it painted a picture of a society so obsessed with statue building that it recklessly deforested its own island to feed the effort, ultimately leading to its downfall. But a revolutionary experiment conducted by archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo proposed a method that aligns perfectly with the oral history. They demonstrated that a much smaller team of just 18 people could move a full-sized concrete replica moe using a controlled rocking motion. By attaching 3 ropes to the statue, one on each side to rock it, and one at the back to steady it and prevent it from falling too far forward, the team could make the moe walk upright, swiveling it side to side in a shuffling gait that could cover significant distance with relative efficiency. This walking method would have required far less timber, primarily for just a few levers, and for stabilizing the statue if it needed to be rested. It suggests the Rapa Nui were not mindless destroyers of their environment but ingenious engineers who developed a low-impact, highly effective solution to a monumental logistics problem. This theory transforms our understanding of the process from one of brutal, wasteful toil to one of coordinated rhythm and skill, a communal effort that was likely accompanied by chanting and ceremony, making the transportation itself a sacred act. Recent archaeological work has further dismantled the old narrative of a society that collapsed from within. Surveys of the island have revealed that the ancient Rapa Nui did not live in a barren wasteland but practiced a form of sustainable gardening known as lithic mulching. They deliberately broke volcanic rocks and scattered them across their gardens. This technique conserved precious soil moisture, suppressed weeds, and enriched the soil with minerals as the rock slowly weathered. This evidence points to a people who were brilliant agriculturalists, actively engineering their environment to support a sizable population rather than passively watching it erode away. Furthermore, analysis of obsidian tools called matar, once thought to be weapons from a period of brutal warfare, now suggests they were primarily general-purpose tools for tattooing, scraping, and processing plants. The lack of evidence for fortified settlements or mass graves from violent conflict further undermines the idea of a descent into cannibalistic chaos. The true story of the Rapa Nui is not one of ecocide, but one of breathtaking resilience in the face of horrific external shocks. Their population remained stable and their culture vibrant until the first contact with Europeans on Easter Sunday in 1722, which was immediately violent. But the true death knell was the Peruvian slave raids of the 1860s. In just a few years, slave ships captured over 2,000 people, nearly half the island's population, and shipped them to work and die in Peru's brutal guano mine. Although international pressure forced Peru to repatriate a few dozen survivors, they brought smallpox with them, which ravaged the remaining population. This intentional genocide, followed by disease and the forced relocation of survivors by missionaries, is what shattered Rapa Nui society. The toppling of the moai, which early European visitors interpreted as evidence of ancient civil war, is now understood to have occurred during this later period of immense social trauma and upheaval. Despite this, the Rapa Nui people themselves endured. Their culture was suppressed but never extinguished, and their descendants today are actively reviving their language and traditions. Theirs is a story not of a people who failed, but of a people who survived one of history's cruelest blows, a testament to the unbreakable human spirit that outlasts even the grandest stone monuments. But the influence of Choco Canyon extended far beyond its immediate canyon walls, reaching across the vast, arid landscape through an engineering project that still leaves modern observers in awe, the Chaco Road system. This was not a simple collection of footpaths worn down by travel. These were formally constructed, carefully engineered highways. Surveyors laid them out with a breathtaking degree of precision, often running perfectly straight for miles before making a single, intentional angular shift to align with a distant peak or a specific celestial point. They were carved into the bedrock of the desert, lined with low masonry walls or bordered by raised berms of earth and stone, and could be over 30 feet wide, wider than a 4-lane modern highway. The scale is almost unimaginable. We've identified over 400 miles of these major roads, and they connected the great houses of the canyon to over 200 outlying communities spread across a region the size of Ireland. The sheer effort involved in building these roads is a clear indicator that their purpose went far beyond simple trade or transportation. While they certainly facilitated the movement of goods, timber from distant mountains, turquoise from mines to the south, pottery, and foodstuffs, their primary function was likely spiritual and ceremonial. Many of the major roads are aligned to key astronomical events. The Great North Road, for instance, runs straight as an arrow for over 30 miles before it terminates dramatically at the steep rim of Cuts Canyon, pointing directly to the north. This wasn't a practical route for moving goods, it was a symbolic pathway. Some researchers believe these roads represented a physical manifestation of the Puebloan worldview, acting as literal lines of connection between the ceremonial center of the world, Choco Canyon, and the sacred mountains and spiritual places on the horizon. During times of great ceremony, processions may have traveled these roads, moving in ritual pilgrimage between communities and the canyon, reinforcing the shared cultural and religious bonds that held the Chaconne world together. This vast network also speaks to a level of cultural connection that stretched across continents. Within the great houses, archaeologists have found unmistakable evidence of trade goods that originated hundreds of miles away. Most strikingly, they uncovered the skeletons of military macaws and the remains of copper bells items that could only have come from deep within Mesoamerica. The scarlet macaw, with its brilliant red, blue, and yellow feathers, held profound religious significance for peoples from Mexico to the Colorado Plateau. Their feathers were highly prized ritual objects used in ceremonies and woven into garments. The presence of these tropical birds, along with the distinct copper bells in the dry desert of New Mexico, is proof of a vast, interconnected trade network. It suggests that Chaco Canyon wasn't an isolated phenomenon, but was plugged into a web of ideas, goods, and perhaps even people that stretched for thousands of miles, exchanging not just commodities but also concepts of astronomy, architecture, and cosmology. This incredibly complex and far-flung system, however, may have also been the source of their greatest vulnerability. The Chaconne system was a masterpiece of coordination, but it was also incredibly centralized and therefore fragile. Everything, the ideology, the political power, the redistribution of exotic goods radiated from the canyon. When the mega-drought struck in the 12th century, it didn't just impact Chaco, it crippled the entire network. The outlying communities struggling to feed themselves would have had little surplus to send back to support the dense population and the non-producing elite in the canyon center. The long-distance trade routes dependent on stability and surplus would have frayed and collapsed. The spiritual authority of the Chaconne priests, who were believed to ensure rain and prosperity, would have evaporated as their rituals failed to bring an end to the suffering. The very roads that had once strengthened the culture by connecting it now became pathways for the rapid spread of crisis, carrying not pilgrims and prosperity, but news of famine, social unrest, and the inevitable failure of the central authority. The system that had allowed them to flourish on a grand scale made their collapse that much more total when the environmental and social foundations could no longer hold. The true window into the world of the Hittites, however, comes not from their imposing walls, but from the thousands of clay tablets unearthed from their royal archives. This was no simple record-keeping office. It was the geopolitical nerve center of an empire, a meticulously organized library of state secrets. The correspondence preserved on these fired clay tablets reveals the Hittite kings operating as master diplomats on the world stage, engaging in a complex and often surprisingly modern form of international relations. We have the actual text of treaties like the famous peace accord with Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh, which not only ended hostilities but established terms for mutual defense, extradition of fugitives, and even the succession of each other's thrones. Other letters show them negotiating royal marriages, mediating disputes between vassal kings, and engaging in sharp, sometimes petulant, exchanges over trade and protocol. A letter from a frustrated Egyptian queen, unable to find a suitable Hittite princess for her son to marry, is met with a coolly offended reply from the Hittite court. This vast diplomatic network, managed through the cuneiform script and the Akkadian language as a kind of Bronze Age lingua franca, shows a society that understood power was wielded as effectively with a stylus as it was with a sword, building and maintaining alliances across the turbulent landscape of the ancient Near East. This diplomatic sophistication was backed by the most fearsome military machine of its era, a force built on two revolutionary technological advantages. The first was their mastery of the chariot, but the Hittite approach was uniquely their own. Unlike the lighter, faster Egyptian chariots designed as mobile archery platforms, The Hittite war chariot was a heavier, sturdier vehicle engineered for a single, shattering purpose: to act as a shock weapon. It carried a three-man crew, a driver, a shield-bearer for protection, and a warrior armed with a long, thrusting spear. Deployed in dense formations, these heavy chariots would charge directly into enemy infantry lines to break them apart, creating chaos and openings for their own foot soldiers to exploit. This combined arms tactic required immense coordination and training, turning the chariot corps into a professional, elite force that could decide the outcome of a battle in a single, brutal charge. Their second, and perhaps more significant, advantage was their pioneering work with iron. While the wider Late Bronze Age world was defined by bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that was valuable, relatively soft, and dependent on long, vulnerable trade routes, the Hittites were unlocking the secrets of a far superior metal. The mountains of Anatolia were rich in iron ore, and Hittite metallurgists became the first to consistently smelt and forge iron into weapons. The process was incredibly difficult, requiring furnaces that could reach vastly higher temperatures than those needed for bronze, but the result was a metal that was harder, could hold a sharper edge, and was far more durable. An iron sword could hack through a bronze shield, an iron-tipped spear could pierce bronze armor. The Hittite kings understood the immense value of this technology and guarded it as a closely held state secret, a monopoly that gave their soldiers a terrifying edge on the battlefield for over a century. They even used it as a diplomatic tool, presenting magnificent ceremonial iron daggers as lavish gifts to foreign rulers, a flex of technological prowess that was as much a threat as a gesture of goodwill. Yet, for all their bureaucratic brilliance and military might, the entire Hittite edifice came crashing down with shocking speed. Around 1200 BC, the capital of Hattusa was not just conquered, it was systematically destroyed and completely abandoned. The monumental walls were breached and burned, the grand gates were shattered, and the city was left to the elements. What is so telling about this final act is what the Hittites did before they fled. They carefully buried their most precious state archives, sealing thousands of clay tablets in royal storerooms, presumably hoping to return one day to reclaim them. They never did. This suggests a collapse so sudden and chaotic that there was no time for an orderly evacuation, yet just enough time to try and hide their most valuable knowledge from whoever was coming. The culprit behind this downfall is one of history's great whodunits, but the evidence points to a perfect storm of calamities now known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. A severe, decades-long drought confirmed by tree ring data would have led to catastrophic crop failures, famine, and mass migrations of desperate people. These climate refugees may have themselves become the marauding bands known in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples, whose attacks destabilized the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire, so dependent on its centralized grain storage and distribution to feed its population and army, would have been brought to its knees by famine. This internal weakness would have ignited rebellions among its restive vassal states and left it vulnerable to external attack. Their sophisticated diplomacy meant nothing when there was no food to feed the messengers, and their advanced iron weapons were useless in the hands of a starving, outnumbered army. The Hittites built a state apparatus of incredible complexity, but it was an intricate machine that could not function when every one of its gears, agriculture, trade, internal stability, seized up at once. Their story is a powerful lesson in the fragility of even the most advanced civilizations when faced with a synchronized failure of the very systems that sustain them. If we truly wish to meet the gaze of the Mach people, we need only look to their ceramics. Their artisans created what many consider to be the most realistic portrait vessels in the ancient world. These are not generic faces or stylized gods. Each one is a distinct individual, capturing a breathtaking range of human expression and identity. We see faces etched with age, marked by scars, or adorned with intricate face paint and elaborate headdresses. Some figures smile faintly, while others seem lost in sorrow or contemplation. Many even have their eyes closed, as if in a state of ritual trance or eternal sleep. The level of detail is so precise that scholars believe these were actual portraits of real people, perhaps revered ancestors, powerful leaders, or ritual specialists. This incredible artistry provides an intimate window into Moche society that is simply unavailable for most other pre-Columbian cultures. We are not looking at anonymous statues, but at individuals with names and stories forever preserved in fired clay, offering a profound and deeply human connection across 16 centuries. This artistic realism extends to their depictions of the world around them, and it is here that the picture becomes more complex and at times deeply unsettling. Moche murals and fine-line pottery frequently depict scenes of ritual combat. These were not chaotic battles but highly formalized duels between two elaborately dressed warriors, armed with clubs and shields. The outcome of these contests, however, was often fatal. The victor is shown grabbing the hair of his defeated opponent, while attendants move in to collect the loser. This imagery points to a practice of taking prisoners in ritualized warfare, not for slavery, but for a far more sacred and grisly purpose. The culmination of this process is depicted in what is known as the sacrifice ceremony. In this elaborate ritual, captured warriors were taken to mountaintop platforms, their throats cut by a priestess-like figure, and their blood offered in ceremonial cups to the presiding officials, often depicted as the warrior priest and the bird priest. For a long time, scholars debated whether these scenes were mythological or real. Then, archaeology provided a chilling answer. Excavations at the Huaca de la Luna revealed a plaza that had been used for generations for exactly these practices. There, archaeologists uncovered the remains of dozens of young men. The bones of these individuals showed extensive evidence of brutal trauma, healed fractures on their ribs and limbs, consistent with the clubs seen in the artwork, and then, ultimately, perimortem fractures that showed they had been dispatched with extreme violence. Their bodies had been left exposed to the elements, and some showed signs of having been deliberately dismembered. The chemical analysis of residue on ceremonial cups found at the site confirmed the presence of human blood. This was not myth, it was a central and recurring part of Moche state religion, a performance of power and piety designed to maintain the cosmic order. To understand why an apparently successful civilization would engage in such a practice, we must consider their worldview. The Moche lived in a precarious balance with a volatile environment, entirely dependent on the capricious cycles of El Niño. They likely saw these climatic extremes not as random weather patterns, but as the direct expression of angry or appeased deities. In this context, the ritual sacrifice of captured warriors was the ultimate act of reciprocity. The blood of strong, powerful individuals was considered the most potent offering possible, a payment to the mountain gods and the ocean to ensure the return of life-giving water and the fertility of the fields. It was a brutal contract with the divine, a belief that the very survival of their world required the ultimate sacrifice. For centuries, this grim calculus may have seemed to work, reinforcing the authority of the priests and rulers who mediated between the people and the gods. But what happens when the offerings are no longer enough? The final, tragic chapter of the Moche story seems to be one of a society pushed beyond the breaking point of its own beliefs. As the climate whiplash intensified, with decades of catastrophic flooding followed by a generation of severe drought, the rituals would have lost their power. The priests who had promised to control the weather through sacrifice were presiding over an escalating disaster. The archaeological evidence at Huaca de la Luna suggests a desperate and terrifying finale. In the final layers, the beautiful murals were covered over with plain clay, as if the rituals held there had been deemed ineffective and abandoned. The sacrifices themselves appear to have become more extreme and less organized. The carefully orchestrated state ceremony seems to have devolved into something more frantic and desperate. the social contract based on the elite's ability to ensure stability shattered. In the face of an unending environmental catastrophe that their entire world you could not explain or mitigate, the people likely lost faith in their leaders and the gods they served. The elaborate system of belief and power that had held the Moche world together for 7 centuries fractured, leaving their magnificent pyramids to slowly melt back into the desert, a stark monument to a civilization that made a brutal pact with nature, a pact that nature, in the end, refused to keep. To truly grasp the scale of their achievement, you have to visualize the landscape. The Garamantes were tunneling through the earth, not with modern machinery, but with simple tools and an immense collective will. The process was a marvel of practical geometry. Teams of workers would first dig a series of vertical mother wells, some plunging over 100 feet down, until they finally hit the life-giving aquifer. Then, from the base of these wells, they would begin the painstaking work of digging the horizontal tunnel, the fagara itself, with just enough of a slope, a gradient of perhaps only 1 or 2 degrees, to allow the water to flow by gravity alone toward its destination miles away. But how did they ensure this perfect, gentle slope across such vast distances in total darkness? They likely used simple but effective tools like water levels or sighting poles, transferring measurements down each successive maintenance shaft to keep the tunnel on its precise, unwavering course. These shafts, dug every 60 to 100 feet along the tunnel's length, were not just for initial construction, they were vital lifelines for the system's survival. Teams of maintenance workers would descend these narrow holes for generations, constantly clearing out silt and debris to prevent blockages and repairing sections of tunnel that had collapsed. This was a society permanently committed to a silent, underground war against entropy, a never-ending labor that was the true price of their desert empire. This hydraulic miracle was the engine that powered their role as masters of the early trans-Saharan trade. With their agricultural surplus secured by the fagaras, they could support a population of traders, craftsmen, and camel herders. The Garamantes didn't just participate in this trade, they effectively invented the template for it. Their most crucial innovation was the domestic camel, which they adopted and bred into the perfect vehicle for desert travel. These ships of the desert could carry heavy loads of goods and travel for days without water, allowing the Garamantes to establish and control the first reliable caravan routes across the terrifying emptiness of the Sahara. From the African interior to their south, their caravans would bring back incredible wealth, ivory from elephants, gold dust, exotic animal skins, and slaves. They would then transport these luxuries north to the Mediterranean coast, where they traded with the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and later the Romans, for manufactured goods like fine glassware, wine, olive oil, and iron tools. The Garamantian capital, Garama, became a bustling oasis metropolis, a cosmopolitan hub where goods and ideas from sub-Saharan Africa met the cultures of the classical world. They were the essential middlemen, the only power that knew how to cross the great desert and live to tell the tale, and they grew immensely wealthy from this perilous knowledge. Yet, the very technology that created their paradise also contained the seeds of its own destruction. The fossil water they were tapping was not a renewable resource. It was a vast underground lake, a precious inheritance from a distant past when the Sahara was a green savanna, and it was being mined with no hope of replenishment. As the centuries passed, the water table began a slow, inexorable decline. Each generation of Garamantian engineers found their task becoming more difficult. The mother wells had to be dug deeper, the horizontal tunnels had to be extended further. The maintenance became more energy-intensive and dangerous as the system grew ever more vast and complex. It was a desperate race against a sinking baseline, and eventually the sheer physical effort and resources required to keep the water flowing began to outweigh the benefits. Their agricultural output would have slowly dwindled, and their population likely began to shrink through a combination of hardship, outmigration, and a gradual tightening of their once abundant way of life. This internal weakening was compounded by external shifts. The political world around them was changing. The Roman Empire, after initial conflicts, eventually established a tense but stable trading relationship with the Garamantes, but the Romans also developed their own maritime routes that could bypass the desert crossing altogether. Later, as the Roman Empire itself crumbled, the demand for luxury goods and the stability of the Mediterranean markets became less reliable, further diminishing the economic incentive for the trans-Saharan caravan trade. The Garamantes, slowly starving from within due to their dwindling water supply and increasingly isolated from the changing economic currents of the wider world, found their power and influence waning. Their story is one of the most powerful cautionary tales from the ancient world. It's a stark demonstration that even the most brilliant engineering is ultimately vulnerable when it relies on the unsustainable consumption of a finite resource. They built a civilization by conquering the desert's thirst, but in the end, they were defeated by the slow, silent retreat of the very water that had once made them kings. As we conclude our journey through these 30 vanished worlds, a haunting and powerful pattern begins to emerge from the dust. From the meticulously planned cities of the Indus Valley to the hydraulic genius of the Garamantes, from the celestial precision of the Maya to the maritime empire of the Minoans, their stories are not isolated tragedies but interconnected chapters in a single, profound narrative about the fragility of human achievement. These civilizations did not simply vanish into a historical vacuum. They were undone by a recurring set of challenges that feel eerily familiar to our modern world. The most persistent theme is the delicate dance with a changing environment. Again and again, we see brilliant societies brought to their knees by climatic shifts they could not control. The mega-drought that emptied Choco Canyon, the monsoon failures that desiccated the Indus Valley, the El Niño whiplash that shattered the Moche world, and the volcanic winter that may have ended the Clovis culture, all speak to the vulnerability of even the most advanced societies to forces of nature. Their fates remind us that our own technological prowess exists within a planetary system that is far more powerful and unpredictable than any human invention. A second, closely related thread is the peril of resource mismanagement. The Garamantes built a desert empire on fossil water they could not replenish. The Rapa Nui people, according to the traditional narrative, deforested their island in pursuit of monumental projects. The Khmer Empire's vast water network, a marvel of engineering, became its greatest liability when the climate turned against it. These are not tales of stupidity, but of success that gradually breeds a dangerous dependency on unsustainable systems, a warning about the long-term consequences of how we choose to harness the world around us. Furthermore, these disappearances highlight the brittleness of complex social structures. The Hittite and Mycenaean empires, with their intricate bureaucracies and international trade networks, collapsed with shocking speed when that network was disrupted. The rigid, bone-rank system of Silla Korea eventually bred the resentment that fractured the kingdom. The authority of the Maya kings and the Moche priests evaporated when their claimed connection to the divine failed to bring rain. This reveals a sobering truth: the more specialized and interconnected a society becomes, the more vulnerable it can be to a single point of failure, whether it's a broken trade route, a discredited ideology, or a collapsed food distribution system. So what do these echoes from the past teach us about our own global civilization? They are not prophecies of doom, but rather the largest dataset of case studies we have on long-term societal resilience. They demonstrate that no civilization, no matter how powerful or seemingly permanent, is immune to collapse. Our current world faces its own set of converging challenges: climate change, resource depletion, and social inequality on a global scale. The stories of these lost cultures are a powerful antidote to the myth of endless progress and a call for profound humility. They urge us to look beyond short-term gains and build flexibility, redundancy, and sustainability into the very core of our systems. Our greatest advantage over the Maya, the Khmer, or the Garamontes is not that we are smarter, but that we have their history to learn from. We can see the patterns they could not. The silent stones of Tiwanaku, the empty courtyards of Knossos, and the buried libraries of Hattusa are not just ruins, they are classrooms. They challenge us to be better ancestors, to think in terms of centuries, not just quarterly reports, and to remember that the true measure of a civilization's greatness is not the height of its monuments, but the longevity of its wisdom. We have the unique opportunity to write a different ending to our story, one where learning from the past becomes the key to securing the future. Now we turn the question over to you. Which of these lost civilizations captured your imagination the most? Was it the mysterious script of the Indus Valley, the tragic story of Rapa Nui, the advanced astronomy of the Maya, or the maritime power of the Minoans? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love reading your perspectives and insights. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history's greatest mysteries, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're always exploring the forgotten corners of our past, and we'd love for you to join us on the next adventure.